Hi, everyone. My name is Kay Dervishi. I'm a staff reporter with New York Nonprofit Media, and I'm very excited to be emceeing today's event. This is our first virtual version of our sixth annual conference, Nonprofit OpCon, dedicated to bringing you key information on how to best streamline processes and operations at your organizations. I'd like to start out by thanking today's sponsors, Cushman & Wakefield, the Parkside Group, Paymerang, Citron Cooperman, Incline Pension Consulting, Nationwide, Nonprofit Sector Strategies, Pentagra, Roberta Katz Consulting, your part-time controller, NFP Advisors, and St. Joseph's College, New York. I would like to point out to our audience members who are joining us on Zoom that there are a few functions that you can use. If you're interested in asking today's panelists any questions, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. There will be time towards the end that the moderator can take some audience questions, if there's additional time towards the end. And please feel free to upvote any questions you find interesting in that Q&A section. You can also interact with other webinar attendees through the chat function, also at the bottom of your screen. Just please make sure to use the drop-down box to share comments with all attendees and not just the panelists. Keep it civil and on point. And also on Zoom, you can change the view settings if you're so inclined in the top right-hand corner of your screen. Just a note for our panelists and attendees to make sure today's event stays on time. I may interrupt any panelists and speakers towards the end of any panels to make sure we can move on to the next section. But there will be some breaks for Q&A and other sort of pauses for any attendees and panelists towards the end. And with that, I'd like to start by introducing our first panel, what's going on between landlords and tenants today during COVID, and what has happened to the office market. The speakers in this panel will be David Lebenstein, Executive Managing Director and Co-Chair of the Not-for-Profit Advisory Group at Cushman & Wakefield, Rachel Casanova, Senior Managing Director of Workplace Innovation at Cushman & Wakefield, and Paula Mangarelli, Executive Account Director of Global Occupier Services, also at Cushman & Wakefield. And with that, I'll leave it to you all. Thanks.
Thank you, Kay. I'm David Lebenstein. I co-chair the Not-for-Profit Advisory Group at Cushman & Wakefield, both in the tri-state area and nationally. All of my clients are not-for-profits or government, and that's the area that we've chosen to work in. In a few minutes, you'll hear from Rachel and Paula, who have a terrific presentation on recovery, reentry, workplace strategies, and I think you'll all enjoy that and learn something. In addition to discussing that, we'll try to provide an overview of what's going on in the office market today between landlords and tenants, and discuss the future of the workplace, suggest some general strategies regarding possible concessions or price changes, such as obtaining more capital expenditure money or lease extensions. But first, let's talk just a minute about COVID-19. Cushman & Wakefield did a survey of 50,000 office workers to determine their patterns and preferences pre and post-COVID, which you will hear more about shortly. Unfortunately for all of us, this epidemic is far from over. At its peak, the country was averaging 31,500 cases per week. And just this past week, the average went back up to close to 30,000 and still heading up. Mercifully, we're doing much, much better in the tri-state area, but other states are deteriorating rapidly. So for the short term, this is quite alarming. I want to give you a couple of quick stats. During the first 3 months of the health crisis, the New York metropolitan area lost nearly 1.3 million jobs. And of these losses, interestingly enough, only 16% were from the office sectors. 16%, think about that. Everyone's saying people aren't going to come back to work. Well, the 16% is the cross-section of office workers. And only 2.5% from the financial services industry. So we believe the office industry is far from dead. The other thing I wanted to mention, balancing that, is another 1.2 million square feet of sublet space has recently come on the market, in addition to the 5.8 million that had been on the market prior to COVID. Now that sounds like a lot, but New York, Manhattan is 440 million square feet, 440 million square feet. So if that's like 3%. So, you know, it's important to have some perspective on these numbers. It's clear that things are slowing down, but most landlords and tenants are in a wait and see mode. Landlords have yet to adjust asking rents as a result of COVID. They sometimes offer some additional concessions in the form of free rent or tenant work, but they're really not moving. So when people ask me what the market is, I can't even answer it. I answer it pre-COVID. I say, this is what it was in January. Do you want to discount it 10%, 20%, 30%, no percent? Take your pick. So did you know that until recently, only 4.4% of office workers regularly work from home? I thought it was much more. And of course, there are going to be many more working from home going forward. But even if that triples, it would be like 12 or 13%. And the surveys show that it's younger people who want to come to work. Some of us older folks are happy to work from home. So the long and the short is, while we do expect there to be more work from home, we also are confident there'll be a great deal of interest in getting back to the office. Right now, we need to feel safe. We need to get the subways to feel safe. We need to open the restaurants, the bars, the Broadway theater, the movies, sports, and cultural institutions. That's when we'll see an exodus back to the city. I speak to my clients every day and they ask things like, can I get a rent reduction? Can I get a few free months rent? Do I have to pay since I'm not occupying the space? What can we do to accommodate the fact that we've not been in our space for months? Well, I'm sorry to break this to you, but my general impression is very few rent reduction or waiver deals are getting done. At best, landlords are assisting with cash flow by allowing a deferral of some rent to be paid back later in the lease. In fact, very few deals are getting done at all. We are seeing some movement with tenants who have less than 2 years left on their lease and seeking an extension in return for some concessions, if not a rent reduction. Then it's more likely you would get something, maybe some free rent or some additional capital. If you have a long lease or you're a credit tenant, landlord's not going to do anything for you. So you know, it's not one size fits all. You really have to look at multiple factors, including the landlord's profile, their mortgage and debt situation, the vacancy level in the building, your credit worthiness, size and remaining term on the lease. Everyone's situation is different. And now I want to turn the panel over to Paula Mangarelli and to Rachel Casanova, our Cushman & Wakefield experts on workplace strategies and readiness recovery. We'll leave some time at the end for questions, which you can send along. Thank you.
Thank you, David, and thank you all for the invite and the opportunity to speak to you guys. In the past few months, they've been filled with tremendous uncertainty, as David alluded to, and much uncharted territory for us all. I'm hopeful that you and your families are healthy and our communities across the globe are on the mend. While this is a horrible thing we're going through, I'm hoping we can say that the worst is behind us. I know for me, the human experience is likely changed forever, but I'm very proud to be part of the Cushman & Wakefield team and taking part in a task force that, as the areas stabilize from COVID-19 pandemic and stay-at-home restrictions are lifted, to be able to talk to you about our return to work plan guide that not only is helping our employees, but our clients as well. As you can imagine, this process will look different for every type of facility, from commercial to higher education, the life sciences businesses, public venues, and nonprofit organizations such as yourselves. The plan that we put together is a collection of best practices and insights that we got from leading subject matter experts from across the organization. It was built from the standards by the CDC, Centers for Disease Control, the World Health Organization, or WHO, and OSHA, so Occupational Safety and Health Administration. That's just to name a few. We at Cushman have made it a priority to promote a safe and healthy return for our employees as well as our clients. And at a high level, I want to take you through what we have put together and for you to consider as the Safe 6 readiness. And it goes from preparing the building, as most of these buildings and spaces have maybe been dormant for a while or not at full capacity, preparing the workplace, controlling the access, creating a social distancing plan, reducing touch points and increasing cleaning, and just communicating for confidence. I can't stress the importance of just communicating not only with employees, but with our clients, helping them with, number one, preparing the building. It's anything from updating your cleaning procedures to partnering with landlords to make sure we understand their policies and how they're going to engage as they begin to open up spaces, engaging vendors and making sure that your building or just your space, it doesn't matter if you have one person or 1,000 people coming in, you have to make sure that people are feeling that they're coming into a building that has been prepped for them to come back in. As you prepare your workforce, so point number 2, deciding on who comes to work, developing that communication as to what they can expect, making sure everybody is aware of all the new policies and procedures. Again, whether you're having 4 people come into the office or 25 people coming into the office. Point number 3 on controlling the access. You know, are there building lobbies? Do you have multiple points of entrance or exits to the building? Implementing visitor policies. Some are saying we're not going to have visitors when we first come in. Providing proper PPE. I'm seeing some of our clients that are providing masks as people walk through. Sanitizing stations. Determining, just flow of traffic through offices or how people are going to come in and out of buildings. And the big one, number 4, we've heard this word, social distancing. What's your social distancing plan? And I think a lot of that is just limiting in-person meetings, leveraging the technology, maybe not going into many of these small spaces, designating a foot traffic pattern. Some are going as far as there's a one-way traffic through your office. Point number 5, which we're seeing a lot of this, is reducing touch point and increasing cleaning. So enhancing cleaning and disinfecting processes. Some are even going to touchless egress and ingress, instituting clean desk policies, removing shared tools. So when you walk into a conference room, you're bringing your own tools, your own pads of paper, your own marker boards to take notes. I mean, we're seeing a lot of it's a behavioral change to make sure people are aware of what they can and cannot do and how their office environment is going to look. So that's why number 6, communicating with confidence, making sure that there's a trusting and transparent culture. We're setting clear expectations. We're testing and validating measures that these work and just having a two-way communication that people can freely ask questions so they know that when they walk back into whatever site, that they're walking in there confidently, it's safe, it's somewhere that they want to be, and they know exactly what the protocol is going forward. So on that note, what I want to do is I want to turn this over to my colleague, Rachel, to go through post-COVID world and the survey results that we collected through the Cushman and Wakefield proprietary tool, experience per square foot. So I'll turn it over to Rachel.
Thanks, Paula. So just to stay on this where Paula was, and David, maybe this is part of how you'll facilitate this, but Paula went through a lot of specifics that's interesting that we've taken from best practices. We've taken it from the Department of Health. We've taken it from the CDC guidelines. And, it's not unusual. We've heard senior executives talking about hand sanitizer, not the expectation, but it is those little things. And it is that we've taken everything that was planned in our facilities and we've thrown it all up in the air and are trying to figure out how it needs to land under these circumstances. So there's no question that is a silly question. Even in the guidelines, there are requirements and there are recommendations. depending on who you talk to. I've heard the extreme that says, like OSHA, if it's a recommendation, do it. I've heard on the other side, if it's a recommendation, we may or may not do it. So Paula brings a huge amount of experience on a lot of that. I bring some, but my focus has primarily been on number 2, which is around the demand and the workforce, and that's what we're going to talk about. But the two are intertwined. It's really hard to say first do this, then do that. We've seen over the last 12 weeks that we've been talking about people coming back, how intersecting all of this is, which has made the back and forth between people like Paula and myself really fruitful to come up with those ideas. So one question that we do always get is, well, who's coming back? And we really posed this question to people very early on who called us and said, how do I get people back tomorrow? And we said, hold on. But even before all these announcements, we were kind of questioning why so fast, considering the science and what we knew. We've seen a slowing of that. These are all publicly announced decisions. So this is not anecdotal. I can't tell you that it's still true, but this is what's been published in the news as to reports on when companies were going to have employees come back. Almost all, if not all of these, have made it employee choice. I am working with a number of nonprofits, same thing. It's largely choice. We do have one nonprofit that we're working with who has said we have more capacity, so we'd like to open the doors for those people. But we certainly started to see a grouping that we see financial institutions who some never actually fully closed. They still had business essential always coming, but talking about a phased reentry early summer. Then we've seen as far out as January 2021. And then we've heard organizations like Twitter who made it into the news by saying, who knows if we ever want to come back. And the conversation over need and want is becoming a really relevant one. We haven't needed to come to the office, many of us, for a long time. You can't look at job descriptions and define who needs to and who wants to. So while the thought is, oh, great, we're working well from home and I'm going to share the data, it's not separate from the fact that there are employees saying, I want to come back, that there is something that they're not successfully doing from home. So all of this is on the table. We don't have precedent here. We would never have said to take an experiment with any organization and said, tomorrow, send everyone home and you'll figure it out. Yet that's where we are. So it's been a really interesting perspective to have. So you see what's been announced, a lot of fall and into January 2021. I'm sure there's more by now, but these were the ones that early on came out. And on the flip side, what we've seen in APAC is we've seen organizations going back rather quickly. And if we think about some of the practices, what the practices in China are so different from what they are here, as an example. So we have employees in China who've said, I'm checked for my temperature at least 5 times from the time I leave home to the time I arrive at a building. We can take whether temperature is a good check or not, but I'm just telling you that in other places, it's a stronger hold on what people can do. The similar instance, you are given a green, yellow, red code that goes to your phone in China. And with that, you can't do things if you don't have the green dot. And the parallel to Apple Pay will not allow you to use it if you don't have a green dot. We've talked so much about tracing here in the US and tracking, and we know that the programs are happening differently in different areas. Connecticut I was speaking to Paul Mounds from the governor's office this morning, and they have really dug deep into the tracing mindset of what that can afford us. But not all organizations, not all buildings, not all Americans are really game for that. So it's just a different play on how we will return. That said, and we talked about, you used the words, I think, Paula, in what you were saying, but early on, again, we said, hold on, companies, let's think about who needs to be there. And framing it this way was really helpful. So I'll go here again, though we're learning more and more. Finding the people who need to come to work because they are essential for the organization is not as easy as reading job descriptions. It is as much of reading and figuring out what people are tied to that they can't access when they're not at work. So that's the first group that we need to figure out how we're going to accommodate. The middle group are those that may overlap, but these are the people who are either immunocompromised, might live with someone who's immunocompromised. We know transportation remains a concern for people, so they can't feel safe to get to work. They may have family obligations. That group, we want them to stay home. Now, there may be overlap with the first group, and in those cases, it's how do we mitigate those responsibilities. The one on the right-hand side, which is becoming really like a phase 2, phase 3 mentality, this is where it gets interesting. This is the work I've been doing for 20 to 25 years, which is why do we come to the office? Who comes? And these are people who are ready, they're able, they want to come, they can safely get there. And now the question is, how do we have them reoccupy? Early on, we heard a lot about blue team, red team mentality. And I can't speak for all the people on the phone in your organizations, but I wondered how knowledge workers could really work that way. There are certain tasks that are that specific and known that perhaps, at month close, the accounting function comes in or things like that. But I want to come in when David is in, and I want to come in when Paula is in, but we actually sit next to each other. So now I'm compromised because I can't do that. So all of those integration points that Paula and I are both talking about readying the building and readying the people, there's a lot of details that start to play out in how we do that successfully. So that's why it's a complex question as to how do we come back? And then it goes back to why do we come back? So we did a study. We were already in the game of doing something called experience per square foot, which is about workplace experience. Pre-COVID, we changed the questions because we were now talking about the experience at home. 40,000 people, 98 countries, 40 companies represented here in this breakdown. 2/3 of it was in the Americas. You see the split of the generations. The industries, unfortunately, we don't feel confident yet in splitting the data by industry because it's just not rich enough yet, but we do continue to launch this survey. This is April and May data. I have to imagine that if we look at June data of new respondents, we will see some changes. So just reflect on it as a moving target, if you will. So what did we find? Well, we found what you've probably been hearing this, people saying, I'm productive at home. It's going great. It's going fine. That tells us that the technology people needed to work on teams was largely there. Most organizations didn't have to invest in new things. It existed. The question was, how well was it adopted by people? But we see collaboration pretty much staying as it was. While we saw so much concern in the mainstream media about open offices, focus hasn't really changed from home to work. It either says we've replaced our coworkers with our disruptions at home, or it isn't the nature of space, and maybe it's the nature of the chaotic nature of our work. So those things you could say, check the box, not really struggling, but there's so much more to what happens in an organization that we're concerned with some of these other things. So one is the ability for people to connect to company culture. High scores for people understanding how their companies are responding, but much lower when it comes to my personal connection to the culture. Our own leadership, senior leadership in New York said, I'm afraid we're on fumes. So what we need to do in the white space, how we solve complex problems, how we know who to go to, there's a sense that culture is somewhat depleted without having people come in. Now, the good news is everyone's in the same situation right now. We do wonder what's going to happen when some people start to come back, some people are at home, and we see much more of people connecting in different ways. We also heard early on, I'm going to take up art, I'm going to take up these skills, I'm going to do all these things now that I'm home. We're actually seeing people have a harder time separating work and home. Those that did work from home somewhat before are having a better experience. Others are not. Some, you have to imagine, as we talk about generations, don't even have a place that they call their workplace, separate from other parts of life. And that's probably part of the struggle. So we're not seeing great gains in anything around well-being. And then when we break that down by generation, we're seeing that, as David mentioned, that our millennials and Gen Z are having the least positive experience. Now, some of that is home responsibilities and whether they have the workspace for it. But we also knew that millennials prior to 2020 really valued being at work. It's not the reputation, but they did. They didn't have decision-making authority. They want to learn from bosses, from peers. The periphery is gone for them. So they only go now where they're invited. We think this has implications into diversity and inclusion as well. The strides we were making in underrepresented voices, we're not sure how that's working now that people are all at home. So the outcome is that, yes, we're making do. We're in somewhat of an emergency situation, but there are some things that we think over time, it sort of validates that place matters. it will matter differently. And as you see, people want more flexibility. By the way, for the last decade, people haven't had to come to work to do their work. They either were asked to culturally, they wanted to be there, and now they're saying we really want more of that formal balance of being able to work in different places. I'm going to skip this. I know I'm sort of talking a long time, but this really is the heart of what workplace innovation is integrating the how we work. And if this has changed our processes, then maybe it suggests that where we live and work might change and what the purpose is when we come back to the office. Now, the other reality is many of us are in leases that we don't get the opportunity to make that change immediately. And that will play out how the real estate market sort of reflects on this. Those who have the opportunity to make a change in the next 12 months may be fortunate, maybe want to stay on the sidelines to figure out what all of this will mean. But it is our opportunity right now, when you can't bring everybody back, to think about who needs to be there, why they're coming, and how we find ways to mitigate cultural issues and just the values of an organization that may be somewhat muted in the current state. And this is just another visual that really accelerates some of that conversation. We see people talking about suburban spoke locations, whether you have access to it or want some sort of short-term ability to have that, but people will likely be able to leave home before they will be comfortable getting to central business districts. So how do we accommodate that, and is there value to it or not? And we really think organizations didn't come into this all the same. They're not going to come out all the same. So we really need to welcome the thoughts of people, your managers, your leaders. The survey did not distinguish how managers feel about productivity and performance. This is an employee reaction. We need to validate that against what leaders need, what executives are thinking is our direction going forward. And does this instigate further change, or are we who we were and we just kind of need to go put our shoes back on? So all of these conversations make this a really rich conversation, and hopefully that sets some context for it.
Thank you, Rachel. That was great. Am I still muted?
Nope, you're good.
And I did want to ask you a quick question. And pre-COVID, Rachel, you were working on workplace strategies with many organizations, and the trend was more densification, squeezing more people into less square footage, and that was the direction many organizations took, not all of them. And now, of course, if you're working with a space that you're kind of stuck in for a while, it's just the opposite. You have to keep the 6-foot distancing, or put people every other desk, or figure that out. So while a lot of people think organizations are going to give up half of their space, today they may need more space to accommodate everyone. So what do you see happening, and what direction is that going in?
So we get asked this question all the time. And I don't mean to say I don't know, but we don't totally know. What we do know is that right now you can't bring back 100% of your staff, right? We know that there are limitations because of the guidelines. So it is going to cause organizations to think in the next 6 months, if not 12 months, about how do they coexist as an in-person and at-home workforce. And I think it's going to be a test of how that works to figure out what the long-term plan is. And I would say, I don't know that this is that important, but we haven't been seeing density increase. What we've been seeing is more space dedicated to other things rather than seats with someone's name on it. And those seats have gotten smaller and they've gotten closer together, which was never advisable. I've been doing this 25 years. We know better. But I will say that the co-working world made us believe that that was kind of okay. And that was a revenue model. But we know from acoustics and individual control and health that they were getting pretty small, but the way we did it was the same way as a New York City apartment, which is your apartment is 300 square feet, but the city is your living room. And we were creating many more spaces for people to be. The opportunity or the realization of how to make those spaces smaller if you want everybody back is going to be that people can't have a dedicated seat. Something that's been a really difficult strategy in New York City for a long time. The big 4 accounting firms have done it for years because many of their people literally don't come to the office 4 days a week. They're at their client. Of course, that made a situation where we didn't need dedicated seats. We saw it happen in some other organizations. We saw it in financial institutions. It wasn't everywhere. But the only way that we match up some efficiencies is by saying we will start to share seats. And there's nothing wrong with it, but it takes commitment from an organization, because what we don't want is employees to say, I'm not even worth a seat. That is so draining. But we can do it if we do it in the right ways, but we have to recognize that to reduce that real estate really means investments in some other things to do it well. And it's not going to be unusual, especially in the nonprofit world right now, that the real estate line item is going to be the one in question. And we get that, but we just have to mitigate what happens when we don't have everyone coming in. And those strategies come from our HR partners, from business leaders, from training managers on what it means to manage a distributed staff. If we think of it as a singular solution, I think it makes crawling back to high performance harder.
This would be a good time for audience members to send in any questions you might have for Paula or Rachel or myself. We did have a couple. One I think we answered, which was from a business model, will this remote working experience significantly impact the future of physical offices, with the cost of leases still having a big impact on the budget? And, you know, like we said, again, it's case by case. If you can shrink and still function well, that's great. If you can hotel space and have people sharing a desk because they're working 2 or 3 days remotely and they come in on certain days. But in Rachel's example, if she and I share a desk, that means I can't be in the same time as she is. So does that make sense? If we're working together on a project, you know, you want to both be there. So you have to accommodate that in some other way. And it can be done. It's solvable.
But it's solvable because organizations that do adopt these tactics, either they provide at least another informal seat for everybody that could come in. So again, you're reducing some of the savings. That affords people to come in when they want. The way that accounting firms used to do it is with reservation systems. And right now it does feel like you're going to have to RSVP to come to work, because that's how we know that there's something available. Under those circumstances, we need to create enough environments that are conducive to those people when they come in. And no one's going to want to come in with the hopes, not under these circumstances, of the hopes that I'm going to get a seat. So it means investing in sort of how we manage occupancy differently.
Right. Paula, anything you would like to add to this?
I think it's all, a lot of it is knowing what teams need to work together, because it also could not, it's not only just the person that's within your same department, but think about our sales team or you know, do they need to speak to someone who's on the account? And just coordinating schedules. What we're going to go into is as Rachel was just saying, is it a reservation system? I think it's having to coordinate schedules day in and day out with not only your own business line, but the business lines that you do business with on a day-to-day basis, just to collaborate work functions.
Okay, that's good. Go ahead.
Sorry, just jumping in, if you're interested in addressing a few more of the audience questions that are coming in. So this one is asking, from a business model, will this remote working experience significantly impact the future of physical offices, with the cost of leases still having a big impact on budget?
Yeah, I mean, I think we answered that. And of course, it's case by case. Many organizations are going to try to get their budget down. And so they may shrink a bit. And if they can do hoteling and find ways to have maybe a third or half the workforce work remotely several days a week, they might be able to do that. But, you know, many groups are collaborative, and there's no substitute for the in-person contact and camaraderie. So it really depends on the culture of the organization, what they do, what they're all about. Obviously, people serving clients, it's much harder. The clients come in, they need to FaceTime with them. Although one client of mine just killed a $12 million purchase of a space because they tested their mental health services remotely and decided they could do it remotely. Of course, they're working with an affluent audience, not a low-income community.
Right. And another question you've addressed in the chat, but in case, you know, there's more to discuss, you know, someone asked, who's making the office decisions, human resources or facilities or both? Could you talk a bit about what the decision-making process should look like?
So the senior executives, the COO and the president or executive director, are typically doing it together with the CFO, who's helping them keep on budget. HR is less involved, maybe more involved going forward because of COVID and some of these issues of who gets a desk or who gets a private office. But my experience is decisions are made at the executive level, exec, CFO, and then sometimes the board plays an instrumental role. Other times the board is just pro forma. Again, depends on the size and type of organization.
The only thing that I would add to that is we've taken everything that was in a lane and we have put it all up in the air to see where it's going to drop. And everything is on the table right now. When we hear CEOs talking about hand sanitizer, we know the game has changed. So the recommendation, if we were asked, would absolutely be to have many lenses at the table. And when decisions have to get made, ensuring other people see it at least as doing no harm to the others. So if there has to be a cost reduction, great. How do you do no harm to the culture of the organization? How do you invest in technology on some level and not have an impact on cost? So we've known this for a long time. Leading organizations have engaged these, what I call the sides of a beach ball, because sometimes you're shadowed from the impacts to other things. Right now, these things are also critical, and because of COVID, HR is absolutely at the table. Whether it's because of job descriptions, whether it's a choice to come back or needed to come back, why aren't you coming back? My father happens to work in an education, I guess it's a state agency in New York. He's 75 and he was told he has to come back. And the only way he could not come back was if he had a doctor's note. It wasn't even enough of his age. He's in an office environment. HR has to be involved in that conversation.
Right.
So it is widespread, and then your office manager and making sure your supply chain is figured out, because from a PPE perspective and what you're going to have, and all of it is really an all hands on deck. Like I have, and I'm not young, but I have not seen this in any of our changes to the workplace to date.
Right, and putting together this recovery readiness manual that we had out there, and it's been talked about, and it was on Good Morning America and everything that we've done. That was encompassed of what Rachel just touched on. It was the operations, it was the financial, it was someone from HR, everybody, because it touches everybody. This is something that you have to go in and make sure we're making decisions that are not only right for the employees, but right for the business. And then also making sure that people are okay with coming back. So, and providing that whatever PPE is available and having them ask those questions and giving them the opportunity. But everything, HR has been at the table, senior leaders have been at the table, operations team has been at the table, because everybody has a stake in this.
I'd like to remind any audience members who are joining us, please feel free, if you have additional questions, to submit them through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We still have a couple more minutes to get to them. Also feel free to share any comments about the discussion in the chat, also at the bottom of your screen. Another audience question that's come in asks, how would you approach the workforce on these workplace changes? Would you recommend creating a committee, focus groups, etc.?
Rachel, you want to take that one?
Sure. So I don't know, this doesn't specify where in the process, but what we've been advising clients is first, figure out what's working and what's not at home. And that's reaching out as much to individuals as possible. And then a task force, because again, we need to know so many different perspectives, is really helpful in engaging from employees who probably are connected to others, that the task force can assist with that. And then speaking to managers as well. So one of the things we did for our own office when we were talking about who should return is we went not to individuals on that, we went to their managers and we said, help us understand who you think should come in, and then speak to each of your employees and figure out if they're willing and able. And we tried to accommodate all that were needed to, and if they were willing and able, or if they were willing and able and didn't need to, if we could accommodate them as well. But the 2 lines of communication right now are really important. But it starts with a task force or a leadership message that says, this is how we want to go about this. As I said, some organizations have been far on the side of this will be an entirely employee choice. Others have said, for whatever reason, parts of their organization, let's take pharma, the lab doesn't have the choice, so they may look differently on the office employees because they're trying to bring some parity. But there has to be some overarching intent from leadership, and then engaging people, a task force, definitely some ad hoc committees are helpful. And what you want to know, even when people come back, getting people in the office on day 1 is one thing. Getting them to want to come back on day 5 and day 10 is another. So it doesn't stop with, we opened our doors, we must be good. It really is about maintaining that communication with people and some group of them as people start to return. You want it to be, a positive experience. You want that to be shared with people who are wondering, and then you want to fix the things that might not be working well.
I see there are a couple more questions. Somebody asked, Melissa asked, are there any for-profits stuck with leases looking to sublease or donate to a nonprofit for a term? How do we find out who they are? So there's literally millions of square feet of space that companies have dumped on the market of various sizes. And, you need a broker to work with you, but you're not going to donate it. It's going to be very rare to donate it. Be very rare to get it donated. You may get a discount. Also, Rachel and Paula, somebody asked if we could post the back to work office safety plan in this chat. I don't know if we can post it or whether it can be sent later.
So it is available on Cushman and Wakefield's website. If you go to cushmanandwakefield.com, there is an entire COVID section that will the road to recovery, the recovery readiness manual is on there. The Safe 6 is on there. There's just a wonderful there's wonderful presentations there that you can take and download.
Great. And I see my friend Ken Takita from Switzer, the architect. They've developed a back to work office safety plan for their nonprofit clients. In fact, he and I are working on, for one of our clients together, working closely with a leadership team that includes human resources, facilities management, operations, and technology. That's helpful information. Thanks. Somebody asked, what do you think will be the future of commercial real estate in the city if office worker return rate decreases and companies don't need as much space? It's a real mixed bag, because yes, there probably will be in the long term more work from home, but you may have missed the opening where I said until COVID, only 4.4% of the office work base regularly work from home. Many of us work a day here or there, but talk about regularly or close to full time. So we don't think it's going to go to 50%. We think it might go to 12%. And the younger people, the millennials, and the X-Gens, they all want to get back to the office. They're living with roommates. It's too noisy. They don't have privacy, or they're home with mom and dad, which may be even worse, although they have better accommodations. So they want to get into the office. And also, if you're going to social distance, you're actually going to need more space to do that properly. So many people are going to keep that in mind. At least that's my 2 cents.
So David, the other thing that I'll add is we've known for years that when we're asked to do utilization analyses, that it's easily 30% of the space is unutilized on any given day.
Right.
That's not new information.
Right.
New information is whether people have been willing to take those hard steps. And the hard steps typically are someone doesn't have a seat with their name on it anymore. We're not cutting out conference rooms. We're not cutting out the pantry. We're cutting out those spaces. It's a big transition. Is it viable? Is it doable? It is, but it becomes way more than a real estate conversation. It becomes a how we work situation. It becomes what tools do we give people, both training and technology and things like that. So this is not new. It's maybe an acceleration of recognition around that. Maybe I had a relationship with my manager who knew I didn't come in every day. I stayed home 1 day a week, but it wasn't a formalized program. The only way this starts to impact the real estate situation is when companies want to make those other transitions, and we'll see what happens. The other thing is that we'd heard employees wanting more flexibility. Now the conversation is coming from leadership saying we don't need the space, but some employees saying, but I want it. And it's a really interesting transition from what we want and what we need. And as I was talking about it in the data results, the running on fumes around culture, on onboarding, on how we know people in our organization to transfer knowledge and know-how and culture. Today, we've done that by being in the same place. It's not that it can't be mitigated, but I don't even think we know all the strategies on how to mitigate that. And David, you talked about the younger generation. There's certainly a need for them to want to learn. They want career development. If David and I are both 25 and he's working from home 4 days a week and I'm in the office, I'm likely going to feel like I'm not cued into some of the things he knows. So it's the human psyche around this, I think is going to be really important. And I don't think, to your point, David, I don't think this is a gut, this is not data, that a large portion of the knowledge worker workforce has been saying, gosh, if only I could work from home every day.
Right.
And it becomes an opportunity when people are spending 3 to 4 to 5 days out of the office. 1 to 2 days keeps an office still pretty busy. And if you take into account what David said, if we are building to a larger square foot per seat because of the physical distancing, or we just realize we went too far, not sure that we're going to see a significant real estate need reduced.
Thanks, Rachel. Okay, I know you want to cut this off. I think we're at the end. I'll just very quickly respond to one more question we had, which is about nonprofits typically sign long-term lease commitments. Do you think that's going to change going forward? And I think the answer is this. For the short term, many nonprofits are going to do short leases, 2 or 3 years, to buy some time and see what happens before they invest in major decisions. But for the long term, I think you invest in infrastructure, moving is a big deal, spend a lot of money, they're still going to want to do long-term deals. But if they can renew for a couple of years, not spend any money, they'll do that. Thank you, everybody.
Great. Thank you so much, David,
Thank you.
Rachel, Paula. I really appreciate you guys taking the time to talk today. And to any of our attendees, if you're interested in reading more of Cushman & Wakefield's insights related to all of this, there's a link in the chat. And with that, before we move on to our next panel, I would love to remind our audience members of all the different functions available on Zoom. If you're interested in asking any questions for the next panel, please use the Q&A button at the bottom, and you can always feel free to upvote any questions that are already there if there are any that are of interest to you. Also, please feel free to take advantage of the chat function, talk with other panelists about the discussions we're having and other attendees. Just please make sure you change the drop-down box to show all comments with attendees and not just the panelists. And also feel free to change the view settings in the top right corner of your screen if you feel so inclined. Again, thank you to our sponsors, Cushman & Wakefield, the Parkside Group, Hay Meringue, Citron Cooperman, Incline Pension Consulting, Nationwide, Nonprofit Sector Strategies, Pentagra, Roberta Katz Consulting, Your Part-Time Controller, NFP Advisors, and St. Joseph's College, New York. And with that, I'd like to begin introducing our second panel, COVID-19 and the potential accounting and financial impacts on nonprofits. Moderating this upcoming panel is Hillary Schafer, CEO of Multiplying Good. Also participating in today's panel are Ronald Tompkins, Executive Director of 82nd Street Academics, Roberta Katz, Nonprofit Finance Consultant, and Ellie Hume, Director of Your Part-Time Controller. And with that, I will leave it to our next panelists. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kay, and we're excited to be here to talk about these really complicated topics at the moment. I mean, finance and accounting inside nonprofits is complicated in the best of times, and then when you throw in budget reforecasting in the middle of the year, you throw in PPP, you throw in EIDL, you throw in lost revenue, you throw in all sorts of things. It's become an area of incredible confusion. So first of all, just a huge thanks to all of all the folks who are on this panel who bring a real world of expertise to this particular topic. I'd like to just start by having them each introduce themselves in terms of both their expertise, and then also I ask them each to provide a fun fact so that we can take what is sometimes maybe a little bit of a dry topic and have some fun with it. So Ellie, why don't you start us off?
All right, well, thank you so much, Hillary. Again, my name is Ellie Hume. I'm a director with your part-time controller. We are an outsourced accounting firm specializing in nonprofit accounting, and we serve all kinds of nonprofits, usually in the budget size of about 500,000 and up. And we're working now remotely for all of our clients and serving them in a very similar fashion to what we were doing on site. And I'm excited to be here. My fun fact is I'm not a millennial, but I just spent 3 months hanging out with my folks to get out of the New York metro area, but just recently returned to my home in New Jersey. So. All right, Roberta?
Roberta, you're muted still.
Somebody muted me. Okay.
There you go.
Okay. My name is Roberta Katz, and I'm the founder of Roberta Katz Consulting. And I work with nonprofit organizations to help them build and maintain strong finance departments. Using the experience I gained working in senior financial management positions for major nonprofit corporate organizations for 15 years. And I think this COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the importance of having a strong finance department. So I work with finance departments to implement processes and systems so that they can produce timely and reliable financial statements and financial data, to mitigate the risk of fraudulent activity, and to efficiently prepare for their certified audits, their financial audits. I also work with nonprofits to help them establish accounting policies and procedures and create an accounting policies and procedures manual, which acts not only as a guide for the operation of the finance department, but also serves policies that include checks and balances, systems of checks and balances to help safeguard the organization's assets. And I work with organizations, I support them in implementation of automated systems and management of the systems, which I have done in many nonprofit organizations I have worked for. And I don't quite have a fun fact, but I have a fact that I'd like to share. I transitioned my accounting career from the for-profit sector to the nonprofit sector about 15 years ago. And I wrote an article and was published in the CPA Journal. It was entitled Making the Transition to the Nonprofit Sector, an Insider's Perspective. And in the article, I detail from my perspective, what it takes to succeed in the nonprofit sector. And I give guidance to those who are looking to make the transition. But at the end of the article, I asked the question, so why would one make the transition from the for-profit to the nonprofit sector? Aren't all finance departments the same? And my answer was, for the most part, they are. But there is one difference in that in the nonprofit sector, the bottom line is not just a number, but it's the fulfillment of a mission. And that is why I work passionately to help nonprofit organizations strengthen their finance departments so that they can support their organizations as they work tirelessly to fulfill their missions.
Ron, over to you.
I'm Ron Tompkins, and I direct a school that helps kids get to college who don't speak English at home. So I'm a practitioner. I'm a management accountant, and I own Turnaround Nonprofit Coaching, which helps nonprofits who want to turn around and stabilize. And my fun fact is, I have 11 children, so I learned that you can either have $1 million or 1 million kids. And
you clearly chose 1 million kids.
I think I made the best choice.
I agree. So let's just jump right into it. One of the things that every nonprofit in the country is facing right now is the world that they imagined in December and January and budgeted for is not the world that we're now living in. And so, I'll put the question back to the team about what's the best way for organizations to manage their to manage their operations, to manage their budgets, to involve their boards, to properly reforecast, and to reforecast in a way that reflects both the needs for accrual accounting and the needs of cash accounting, because at the end of the day, cash is king. So Ron, why don't you start us off on that, because you had you have an impassioned view.
Well, I've got 98 staff, and I can delay the rent. I can delay almost any bill in my life except payroll. And so I said to the board, through the end of August, we are running off the cash flow forecast, and I'll give you a budget for the year or for the remainder of the year when I've got a timeline that I can understand. And right now in education, I don't understand September. So see you in August.
Ellie, why don't you add to this? What's your view in terms of what organizations should be doing from a best-in-class perspective to position themselves financially to not only operate through this time, but to be standing on strong feet at the end of it?
Yeah, absolutely. I really believe that organizations need to be forecasting, taking a look at what they thought would happen when they did build that budget, starting, coming into January, or even, they were mid-year with a June year end, and starting to think about, well, what did change? What new expenses did we incur or need to incur because we're all working remotely? What expenses aren't we going to have? But, like Ron, payroll is number one. So what are we going to do to make sure that our folks continue to get paid? People are making very, very tough decisions to lay off staff right now, or furlough temporarily, or cut salaries. And so, making sure that the finance team is really ingrained and part of those management discussions, so that the team can be running scenarios and figuring out, like, well, what if we do this? How does it impact the bottom line? If we make these payroll changes, will that actually be enough to get us through a longer period of time? So being able to really run a bunch of scenarios of what's going to happen. And then once you kind of pick the scenario that you think is going to work the best, then start using it and comparing it to your budget, comparing it to what's actually happening on a regular basis, making sure that you're still getting monthly financial statements, and that you're using that to say, okay, well, this is what happened on an accrual basis, but how does that translate to my cash balance? When am I going to need to dip into lines of credit that I might have access to? How do I get access to lines of credit that I've never had before? And I think that's really where the government is coming in and saying, we're going to help you get access to things that you wouldn't normally have had access to. So, you've got the PPP, our favorite PPP, Payment Protection Program funding, and whether it ends up being forgivable or not, it's still a really great low interest loan for organizations to be using right now to help cover some costs. So the EIDL, yes, everybody went in and applied and they got that initial grant money, whether it was, a couple thousand or 10,000, and now they're starting to get the paperwork to turn to say, okay, now that I've applied, I can get a loan from this. How do I need this loan? Do I not need this loan? And so I think it's just being able to access capital in order to use it in your scenarios to see if you can make it through. And we don't know how long it will be, but you need to try to buy yourself enough time to come up with new business strategies. So on one hand, the organization is building all these new ideas for how they're going to continue to operate remotely and still deliver on their mission. And finance is trying to figure out how to make the money work. But it's really, really, really important that both sides are talking to each other throughout all of the situation and really be in collaboration to move the organization forward.
And Ellie, I'd like to just put in my more rational moments, I do scenario planning also. But I did I did write a tool on 17 sources of cash after I got the scenario, looking just at the cash flow statement, which I've always ignored. And Probably I'm the only accountant who never could figure out what that was doing. But I then went to investing, operations, and financing and said, where am I going to get the cash for each of my scenarios? So I do agree with you. It's just that I've developed a fascination with cash.
Well, cash is king, and you have to keep an eye on it no matter what. You can't do anything without cash. But I think there's a lot to be said with everything else. You know, like you said, you can delay expenses and not pay them right now, but that doesn't change the fact that you incurred them and you still have to pay them at some point in the future. And so figuring that how all that's going to play out, that scenario planning and the forecasting in a short amount of time, maybe the 1 month. Some people are doing weekly cash flow forecasts or daily cash flow forecasts, but you've also got to be thinking on a monthly basis, on a quarterly basis, you know, what's going to happen in 6 months, 12 months from now, and really be thinking about how you're going to be changing your business model to get that new revenue, or are you still going to be able to get the same sources of revenue that you had with just different delivery methods? So I think it's just, my key point here, I think, is that it's great if you have the finance team to be doing all of this for you, but just remember, they can't do it in a silo. They need to be partnered with the programs folks, with the management team, to be understanding, and the development team of what's your plan, so that we can fit that into any scenarios and forecasting that's being done.
Roberta, what's your view and sort of best advice for budget reforecasting, both on a cash and accrual basis?
Yeah, I see, you know, as we're doing these scenario plannings and we're looking at monthly financial statements and the finances role, it's very important that the finance team ensure that the number, for example, if you're looking at your accounts receivable, what are your accounts receivable? It's important that the finance team has processes and systems in place to ensure that all the receivables are accounted for the month and all the payments have been properly applied, so that when you're looking at a receivable at the end of the month, does that in fact include all your receivables, so that you can do, you know, scenario planning, like, you know, of course now your receivables with the cuts from government funders, we don't know that we'll get all the receivables, but at least you need to have an accurate system for tracking what your receivables are when you're making these crucial decisions. And the same goes for the payables. I mean, looking at your payables, I think a lot of nonprofits now are struggling with getting everything, you know, all the information, all the vendor invoices in to come up with what is our real payable. I mean, a lot of vendors have gone out of business and you know, or many of them are struggling, and they get, you know, that send invoices in, or so you don't really have all the information you need to come up with that accurate number. So I think now is the time when it's crucial that the finance department have those systems in place, so that they can provide it to, you know, the program staff or the executive management team to make these crucial decisions. And then, of course, I agree completely with Ellie on looking at the program side and looking at the finance side. I mean, you need to look at your programs from a program profitability standpoint. You know, what is the financial stability of each of your programs? That's only part of it. The other part of it, when you're looking to possibly cut costs, is to look at whether these programs are directly aligned with your mission. And I think that's important, because what I've found is that a lot of organizations, you know, have an initial mission and they have programs related to that mission, but then other opportunities come along that are not directly related to the mission, but noble causes. So they'll take on the contracts, and what happens then, it becomes a financial drain on their bottom line. So they need to look at both. They need to look at the bottom line, and they need to look at their mission. And I think together, you know, you need to work on your budgeting and your forecasting from there.
So, so that raises a sort of a shift in the conversation, right? To, you know, in this time, all organizations are being forced to look at their systems and processes, to look at the technologies they're using, and to make very hard decisions about their headcount, about what they spend money on, and analyze every dollar in a way perhaps they didn't have to before. So, Roberta, I'm going to stick with you for a second, particularly on this topic of, you know, what are the tools that organizations can use to appropriately evaluate the ROI or the return on investment each of their programs and where they're spending money to come out the right side as they connect it to mission.
Yeah, we talk about using technology, and I think this COVID-19 pandemic has really kind of moved the needle in a big way, and that organizations, it's no longer a luxury, but implementing technology is mandatory. And by that, I mean not only cybersecurity, because we know in times of crises, that's when your risk of being subjected to fraud just goes through the roof. So it's the cybersecurity, and it's also using automated systems for processing transactions, whether it's for processing your purchase orders and accounts payable, your invoice processing, or whether it's budget and forecasting. You need to be able to do this remotely so that it could work from all remote locations. So I think where a lot of organizations were very resistant because of the cost, I've implemented many, as I mentioned, many systems at many nonprofits, and it is costly, and it is quite time consuming because I myself worked on the implementation. It needs to be set up right. You can't just implement something and assume you'll press buttons and it's going to work fine. The setup is important. You need to have the proper workflow, the proper approvals, the proper people doing it so that you have confidence, and everybody needs to use the systems. But when they're set up right and they're used, I think it's a tool that's now mandatory for all nonprofits. And it's as I say, it gives you information that is crucial for making these very important decisions that organizations are making. So technology is really, I think now, as I say, no longer a luxury, but mandatory.
Ron, you're very systematic in all things. And your cash tool, by the way, reference was someone requested that you share it afterwards. Do you have your own tool that you use to analyze the ROI of every dollar you spend as it pertains back to your mission?
I guess I do. I've got another tool called 7 Numbers for the CEO, and it takes your entire budget. And I did a study of nonprofits in New York City that I like. And I realized that they had some common characteristics on how much they spent on OTPS 1, program payroll, management, OTPS 2. So yes, I've got a ratio system where if you tell me your total revenue, I have a pretty good idea of what I think you should be spending in different major categories. And then I would go back, certainly to Roberta's point, she's got a point on mission relevance, which I think is critical. That's not just about measuring the ratios within the budget, but that's saying, is this thing worthwhile to begin with? Or is it bringing in, Roberta, I'm sorry, I do like cash. So if you can bring in $10 million with your program, I don't care if it's mission relevant or not.
I get that, and I'm all about that, but we are here.
I haven't found the $10 million success story yet that was not relevant, but I'm still looking.
No, I know, but it's at times like this when you're really looking like, where can I cut and what should I be looking at? I mean, I've been through, 5-year strategic planning sessions that went on for, 6 and 7 months, and we chiseled it down and we whittled it down, looking at program by program, and they were all painful. And every program person made their case for keeping the program. But one by one now, you really need to look at the programs, and when you're making decisions, you have to make the most educated decision.
Well, can I get to your point on fees? We had not done ACHs, and at a previous OpCon, I came in contact with Signature Bank, which does a lot with nonprofits. They happened to say we don't have any fees for a lot of these services. And so when the virus hit, we had to return $250,000 in tuition to about it was about 500 entries in ACH. And we paid no fees. And my understanding is that in some other cases, you might end up paying quite a bit to do that many transactions. So have you seen anything that was cheap for technology?
No, nothing. To your point, though, that's very good that you didn't pay, because I also was involved in a situation where we had to return a lot of fees for different reasons, and there was a fee, and it became very costly. I don't know one that's particularly inexpensive.
Roberta,
Yes.
Roberta, somehow your volume just went way down. So it almost sounds like you're whispering.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Nope.
I'm unmuted and my sound is.
Well, Hillary also
Fine, it just faded. The Ellie, do you want to jump in here while Roberta's?
So when I'm thinking about return on investment and figuring out if your programs are operating efficiently, I mean, the first thing you have to do is, are you closing your books regularly? Are you allocating your expenses to your programs? And on a regular basis, and without that, you don't know where you stand with each of those programs. And if you haven't done that, that's really the first step to be thinking about, is everything that we're doing, adding to the organization? And then sometimes it's not, and you might decide, well, that's okay, because this activity that we do brings so much awareness to the mission that we're comfortable operating this one at either, a near break even or at a loss, because we have other programs that make up those things. So you're making major management decisions about those programs. But when you start to see that none of your programs or a lot of your programs are consistently operating at a loss, you then have to sit down, executive director with the board, and say, hey, should we be doing these activities if we can't operate them efficiently and at a profit? Because really, I think a lot of people forget that nonprofits should be making a profit. The bottom line should be a positive number, should be a healthy positive number, because without that, you can't continue to sustain the mission over time. So, this is a time where organizations are taking a step back and looking at what they are doing and saying to themselves, is this the right thing for us to be doing right now? And if we can't keep doing it the way that we've done it, are there better ways that we can be doing it now for less cost and, more efficiency with less people? Doing all of this is part of scenario. And I think it's really important that you have a strong backbone in your finance team that can say, I'm closing the books every month quickly, efficiently, and accurately, because you cannot be making these major decisions about your business without solid financial information backing it up. In terms of the technology conversation that's been happening, I agree with Ron. There was a really quick movement over to being more electronic in the way that you pay your vendors, in the way that you accept money from donors. It's very, very unfortunate that schools and educational related organizations had to return a ton of tuition money. Camps had to return the advances that people had been paying for their summer camps. And that was a lot of work. And kudos to you for finding Signature that allowed you to do that without the fees. I don't think there are many banks out there that would have done that the way that Signature did. So kudos to them. We're working with Bill.com on a lot of our clients and are able to get them affiliated with us so that they can get discounts. But we're not able to make that free to anyone. But we are able to provide discounts because of the affiliation. So, but you have to talk to your bank. I think that's really key. Regardless of who you bank with, what options do they have for online bill payment? How much are the fees for the transactions? Is it worth it in order to not have to be frustrated over the fact that you can't print checks from home, or that, your CFO who is printing the checks from home has to then get them shipped to the executive director for signature, those kinds of things. And were they all properly approved? And so finding the right technological tool to get you to do a workflow on and approvals and signatures and all of that is really, really important.
All right, so Roberta, let's test your volume.
Okay, did you hear me?
It's still a little light, so you're just gonna have to speak up.
Okay, let me make it the loudest. I apologize. Do you hear me now?
Yeah, no, that's better. I think just in the interest of time, we should shift to the topic that is top of almost everybody's mind, which is really understanding the PPP and the EIDL and how to account for it and how to understand it and how to think about it. And particularly for organizations that have a June 30 year end, but for all of us who are looking at PPP and trying to figure out where the heck to put it on our balance sheet and income statement. Ellie, do you want to start on that topic?
Sure. So, and I also saw a question here in the chat about is there any definitive guidance on how to account for the forgiveness of the PPP money, and can we take it into our income statement instead of the balance sheet? And Roberta shared a very interesting document from the AICPA, and I since have found out that our firm is actually talking to a lot of different auditors right now to get their opinions on interpretation. And I think that a lot of organizations, it's almost like you get to choose. Do you want it to be a loan that then you record a gain when it's forgiven, or is it a conditional contribution, which when it is a conditional contribution and you received it in advance, you're also recording it as a liability. So it's a refundable advance until those conditions are met. And I think it will be unclear at what point do you decide that those conditions are met? Is it, as you're spending it as the condition met, or only after you've spent it all and you've applied for forgiveness and you're working under the assumption that you've met all the conditions to receive forgiveness, can you then record it as a contribution? So those are definitely going to be big conversations that each organization will individually need to be having with their audit firms, especially if you're a June 30 year end. Regardless, there's going to be all kinds of new footnote disclosures required in your audit statements in order to put the information out there for people to understand why you now have this large liability on your books, or an unexpected source of revenue, and it really needs to be an open conversation. There are tons of webinars right now. Our firm is doing a lot of educational webinars on the PPP funding, but so many accounting and audit firms are doing similar webinars, and just the the information that we have is changing so rapidly, and we're just trying to get it out to anyone as quickly as possible. We have a link on our website called Staying Afloat Resources. We have recorded webinars that we've done in the past, and links to new webinars coming up. So I encourage anyone to really take a look at that. If you don't have a source that you've recently been using to get that information, the new application for forgiveness came out. They extended the period of time you get to use the money. You get to, depending on when you received your funds, you can choose if you want to use it in an 8-week period or a 24-week period. So there's a lot of things going on right now in the PPP world. But you have to be very diligent about not double dipping on funds that you have available, particularly when you're thinking about federal grants or federal pass-through grants that come through the state, because you can't be using 2 sources of money for the same expenses. And then, trying to go back to some of your funders and saying, well, can I extend my grant period a little bit so I can spend the PPP money first and then be able to use your source of funds? Or because we got delayed in actually performing on the grant because we couldn't do the program activities, can we get a no-cost extension, be able to use our PPP funds during the period that the program wasn't active, and then jump back on to using the grant funds for when the program becomes reactivated? So I think there's a lot going on in the PPP world. So I encourage anybody to ask a million questions and talk to your auditors.
Roberta, why don't you jump in here?
You hear me? I'm sorry. I'll try to speak loud. I just wanted to mention that, you know, there is a lot of question marks, but one thing's for certain is you're going to need to track and identify these expenses. So if you haven't already done so, you need to set up a separate cost center where you're, you know, coding all your expenses to this, and you need to keep all your supporting documentation for all the transactions for everything you've spent against your PPP loan. So, and again, it should all be scanned because we don't know, remote working now, you have, you know, you're in a mindset where everything needs to be available so it could be submitted electronically. But as you're spending the money, set it aside, make sure you have the documentation.
And
Yeah,
Ellie,
no, that's a great point. And go ahead, Ron.
I'd like to extend your warning about the danger of double dipping to state and local contracts. We get about 60% of our income from city contracts. And they said a few weeks ago that they would not accept double dipping, so that if you claim a contract person on the PPP, they will claw back the city money. So we turned around suddenly and we're very careful to make sure that if you were being paid on a city contract, you're going to stay on that contract. And we are switching over to the PPP money for the tuition side, or the side that was somehow supported differently. And in one case, we had a contract where there was a significant deficit, about 70,000. So we were able to take some of the expenses off that contract, which was never going to pay the full amount anyway, and claim that. But I think that your idea of double dipping, people need to be really thinking about that.
Yeah, there's a lot of caution right around the double dipping, and it speaks also to one of the questions which is on the chat, which is what are the ways the EIDL money can be spent other than payroll, right? And as the rules obviously continue to change, the original rules said you couldn't get an incremental SBA loan and expect your PPP to be forgiven, and then that has morphed somewhat. Who would like to provide some clarity for the group around what can and cannot be forgiven, and how applying for the subsequent EIDL loans may interfere?
Sure. So, I mean, I'll take a first stab at it. The PPP money, I think everybody's a little bit more clear on what it can be spent on. You've got your payroll and you've got your non-payroll costs that are more rent and facilities related expenses. Whereas it's my understanding that then any forgiveness could potentially be reduced if you got EIDL, if that initial EIDL grant, because they're both government-based funding sources, giving you money for the same period of time and the same potential expenses. I do not know if EIDL is limited to only the same types of expenses. I would think that you could spend it on other operating expenses that the PPP may not cover. But again, that's the initial money. And then you get, if you go through with the loan application and qualification and acceptance of the actual EIDL loan, that's loan money. And I don't know that there's a ton of restrictions on what you will be able to spend it on, because you still got to pay that back. And with interest, and you know that they're extending the period of time that you'll be able to pay it back, and the interest is very low, but it is a loan to your organization, much like a line of credit. And typically those sources of funds, you're able to cover whatever expenses you need to cover with it, and then figure out how to make up the revenue so you can pay it back.
And do you feel, Roberta, Ron, or Ellie, that it's been sufficiently clarified that that taking an EIDL loan will not interfere with the forgivability of the PPP loan to grant?
My feeling is that if the amount is small, the whole thing is going to disappear. So I think I saw something under 2 million that this kind of thing was just going to disappear in the end. But
You mean the amount of the PPP?
The amount of the EIDL.
Got it. Okay.
We got 150,000, so it's not very much money on this grand scale of things. And so either we've got a 30-year loan or we've got a grant, in the 1 year in the 1 year forecast, I'm not too concerned about which way it goes.
There has
Roberta?
not been any indication that EIDL would be forgivable. Only that
No, but there was,
initial
but originally,
grant portion that you got, kind of that advance up to 10,000 when you did the original application. They're allowing you to count that as revenue, as a grant, no conditions. But if you accept the loan that comes along with that, that's a loan not subject to forgivability like the PPP funding.
no, I understand that, but the original PPP guidelines suggested that if you took the EIDL loan, that it would interfere with the forgivability of the PPP.
I think the 10,000 does. If you, that first 10,000 of the.
Yes, it does.
So
That reduced the amount you could get in the PPP.
Mm-hmm. Or you need to somehow add 10,000 more in PPP as expense to claim. Otherwise, you can't double dip there either.
Roberta?
I don't know.
That's my understanding as well. And I haven't seen any, guidance to the contrary as of this point.
There's a specific question on the chat about guidance from the SBA regarding if the PPP will count towards the spending limit for UAG audit. It's a fairly specific question. Can anybody answer it?
Where is it? And just, that's the uniform guidance. So that the old A133 that people still like to call it, the governmental funds subject to that threshold. I think it's still up in the air, but I've seen guidance where it will not be counted towards the 750,000 threshold in New York.
Yeah.
But is that what you're saying, Roberta?
That's exactly what I've seen. It will not count toward the 750 because it's considered funds from an independent source. It's not considered a loan from the federal government, which the EIDL is and should be included in your CFA. So that's what I've read, and I haven't seen anything to the contrary.
Right. I think I read something today where it'll be included in the list of funds, but it won't be
Counted towards your 750.
it won't count towards the threshold.
And there's a subsequent question about EIDL. It specifically says, got to be careful with the EIDL because allowable costs are only those which would have been covered had COVID not occurred.
Okay.
Is that accurate?
I don't know the answer to that.
I as well, but it would be interesting to see how you prove that an expense is not directly related to COVID. I mean, some are very clear, but others might be a little murky.
All right, moving on a bit. Let's talk a little bit. Let's go back to the question of auditing. All this conversation around PPP and EIDL and how organizations can and should think about all of the implications of the CARES Act for a single audit. Any particular guidance other than make sure that you've chosen your auditor incredibly well so that they can guide you through?
I mean, I do think that nonprofits are oftentimes limited to the quality of the auditor that they have access to because of the fees involved. So I do think it's important, regardless of the auditor that you work with, that you talk to them. Like, if you haven't already started talking to them, you definitely should, making sure that they are staying up to date on the latest and greatest, and that that they know things that you don't know. So it is your financial statements. You have to remember that the organization and management, they are responsible for producing the financial statements in line with accounting guidance and generally accepted accounting principles. It is not the auditor's responsibility to produce those statements for you under those guidelines. And so you've got to be proactive about making sure that you know what has to be in those financials, and whether that's working with a financial consultant like your part-time controller or Roberta, in order to get the knowledge base you need on your side to be able to produce those financials and have those in-depth conversations with the auditors, you need to be thinking about that now. And if your audit firm is not a firm that does a lot of nonprofit audits, if they're typically a for-profit, if most of their clients are for-profit entities and they're just doing you a favor, you have to be very leery of whether they're actually staying up to date on what's going on and what's needed to document and to review your financials in order to be in compliance with nonprofit guidelines.
Ellie, could I ask you a question about that?
Sure.
Generally, when I'm looking at somebody else's financials, if they're paying about 1% of their gross revenue between the auditor and any financial consultant, then I feel they probably have quality advice. And if they're paying a lot less than that, they better be pretty good themselves. How would you react to that?
Well, I mean, that's very, I would have a hard time. I have to like quantify, what does that mean? So
like on a $5 million company revenue, you'd be paying about $50,000 between the audit and the financial consultant.
I think that is not a fair estimate, because if they're a $5 million organization and they do not have an inside team, like they don't have an internal accounting team, $50,000 sounds like really only their audit fee, or slightly more than their audit fee, because audits for $5 million organizations aren't cheap.
Mm-hmm.
And when the bigger organization you get, the more expensive those audits are. But if you're looking at a 5 million and you only see 50,000 in financial costs, and you're assuming that that's audit plus like accounting services, like your part-time controller, I would think that that's very low.
Okay.
So that actually speaks to the sort of slight shift for different ways to adjust their cost structures. One of the things that a lot of organizations are looking towards is whether they should be outsourcing their finance departments. Ron, what's your reaction to that?
Well, especially when I'm with Roberta and Ellie, I'm all for outsourcing because I'm having a hard time hiring competent accountants coming out of college. So I am frustrated that if you're hiring, if you're looking for an accountant and somebody comes out and they've got a good bachelor's, it does not mean they are ready to be a good accountant in the nonprofit world. And we've got low margins, so the last thing we can do is have ineffective key people on our staff teams. And so no, I have not outsourced my finance department, and I'm extremely happy with the accounting person I've got right now. But I do have this other frustration structurally, is that it seems to be a department where there's frequent turnover in the nonprofit world. Perhaps there is in the for-profit world as well. But I do think that outsourcing is an interesting possibility, and that's where I'll stop.
Yeah. Roberta, how about you?
Yeah, I have personal experience with that because one of the nonprofits I work with, I was the director of finance, and the board decided to outsource our whole finance function. I think it was probably a financial decision. I get that, but I think there are issues when you outsource a department. You always think you're going to save money, but there are certain things that you do lose. For example, we dealt with a very needy population, and the finance department provided really like emergency right away respond, was that kind of responsiveness to our family. We were part of that family that I think gets lost. And also in terms of you talking about the staff you hired, may not be at the quality. When you have an on-site staff there day to day, sitting in the seats, you're able, like I sat in my seat and I knew exactly what was going on. I taught my staff, we worked together. Emergencies came up all the time and we were there in lickety split, that's it. We knew if we got that emergency that if somebody needed something, we would drop everything and we'd work together and get it done. So you lose that cohesiveness that you have when you have an in-house finance department. But unfortunately, I think a lot of organizations are making it purely based on financial decisions. If it's going to cost them less and maybe they can't find qualified staff, that they're going to outsource the department. But, you know, me personally, I mean, we put our heart and souls into that, and we we were all crying. I mean, they called us in the boardroom and we all started to cry because this was our family, and these were the people we service were just part of our family. So there's really a give and take. So you really have to do all kinds of considerations when you decide to outsource.
So do you then recommend a blended approach for organizations?
No, I actually think it could, certain functions can be outsourced within your finance department, but in general, I think
Such as?
if you can get, well, maybe you want to just do your AP or your processing, your invoice processing, you know, outsource that and leave the whole GL function, your general ledger function and all the, you know, transactions, leave that in-house, but just outsource the bill paying and the accounts payable portion of it. But if you ask me my preference is to hire good, you know, people in-house, and, you know, then you could also work, you know, as I say, possibly using part of your operation to outsource. But from personal experience, I mean, I thought that it was working together as a team has a lot of benefit.
Ellie, how about you?
Well, I mean, I have a pretty strong opinion on this, given obviously, we specialize in outsourced accounting for nonprofits. So I see a great benefit in the efficiency and perhaps some of the cost effectiveness that comes along with outsourcing the position. I also feel like, given that there are concerns and organizations go to great lengths to try to find qualified people, an outsourced solution is actually a much easier way to get the qualified people you need into your organization. And also you can take a look at the operations that are happening in the finance functions and realize that you don't need a 5-day-a-week AP person. You don't need a 5-day-a-week receivables person. You don't need a 5-day-a-week controller. You might need, you know, a bookkeeper once or twice a week to handle all the basic transactions. And then you might need, you know, a higher level controller, CFO, who understands closing the books, understands preparing financial statements, understands interpreting those financials for management and the board, being part of those strategic conversations. But the quality of person that you want in that role, many nonprofits, especially small ones, can't afford that type of person on a full-time basis. So that's why I really think outsourced services shine, is when you don't need someone 5 days a week, or you need the skill set of someone different on a part-time basis. And so, you know, I think that there's a good, there are cases for completely outsourcing, but I've seen it work the best when there's a hybrid version of some work is done by internal staff and some work is done by an outsourced provider, because you still have some boots on the ground with those fires that come up, but also good outsourced providers will be able to make time when fires come up. But our goal is to always try to plan in advance. Like, let's try to minimize how many times fires pop up, so that we can still serve you on a regular basis. And that's really where I think the balance comes into play. You have to consider, you know, when you do have a full-time person, you've got their salary and all of their benefits and providing, you know, the computer equipment and the office space and all of these things. And then now that we're all working from home, I think many organizations have started to see where they could combine some of the functions and create more efficient workflow with less people. And that might, you know, I think more organizations are looking at their internal teams and saying, is this the right team? Are we able to function in any environment? And I think, unfortunately, what's happening is people are realizing that sometimes they were overlooking their lacking of skills in person because they were such a nice person and they've been with the organization for a really long time, and, you know, they're close to retirement or whatever those reasons might be. But now that we're in a remote environment, 24/7, those people are even less able to perform on the job. And now that's wasted resources, unfortunately, on staff that aren't affected. And so organizations are having to really look at that, and that is really where an outsourced solution may make a lot of sense. So happy to talk to anybody that's interested in learning more about what outsourced solutions do.
Yeah.
Ellie, could I?
Okay, go ahead, Ron. You were first.
Just Ellie, to your point of analyzing how much you need a particular function, if you hire an accountant, I think it's good to do a job study and make sure that you haven't hired a glorified secretary or an office attendant filing paperwork, that you have a substantial need for the key accounting task for which you've hired. I like that point.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in here. I completely agree with you. And I think now is really the time when organizations looking at their finance departments, need to look at increased efficiency of what their staff do. I mean, look at the positions and look at how they do their functions. And the important thing, I think, is that it all needs to be documented. We need to know how does each of our staff perform their jobs? We see now, you could have staff that if they, let's say, get ill and they're out for a month or 2 months, I mean, you're not going to have two people doing the same job, but you need to look at make sure you have documented procedures. How does that person do their job? And so that you have step-by-step process. I mean, in organizations I've worked for, I've put together an operations manual, which lists step-by-step what everybody does, the steps, and also, screenshots of the software that the data goes into, and the documents they use, and then the general ledger, what it looks like at the end. So somebody could pick it up and do the job without, really having an in-depth knowledge of it. So I think nonprofits need to look at their finance function for efficiencies, make sure your department's working efficiently, and make sure that each person's role is well-defined, and then you can make decisions. Do I need to make changes? So I agree with what Ellie said. I think it's, it's multi-level. It's not just, one size fits all.
Yep. Oh, Hillary, you're on mute.
Yep, sorry. So we've talked about a bunch of different pieces of this sort of operational reevaluation as it pertains both to sort of need and cost, but also as it pertains to running an efficient organization and finance capacity. What are, in sort of a more holistic view, what are a piece of some advice that each of you might be able to give around the process that nonprofits should be going through in this time to properly evaluate their operations, to also think about things like recovery plans and surplus planning? What's the overall piece of advice that you'd like to give to the group around how to go through this very difficult process?
Could I answer that by tacking on to Roberta's comment about key processes? And in my own work, I think there's 14 key processes for a nonprofit. And most of us are too small to be good at all of them. And so what I tell people is be good at 3 and be prepared to take fines and regulatory pushback on the other 11. And I think one of the ones you got to choose. That's
You're
why
tough,
I said
Ron. I mean,
wow. Wow.
I said I was the practitioner here. And one of the 3 that you've got to have, because you cannot abide by the fines or possible imprisonment, I want to avoid jail, is your financial processes. And we've got like a 12-page financial process, month by month, key processes documented, plus our internal controls manual, just because the price of failure in this particular area of the company is simply unsustainable. Thank you, Roberta.
Yes. And if Ellie, did you want to speak? If I would just jump in there. My recovery, or I like to call it a restart plan, has 3 elements. It's finance, it's technology, and it's human resources. And in the finance piece, I mean, we talked about evaluations of programs and financial sustainability, looking at costs, eliminating non-essential costs, renegotiating payment terms with your vendors, and that's in terms of financial management, as we just spoke about, documenting your accounting policies and procedures. I also want to bring in something that Ellie had mentioned about closing your books for the month. It's crucial that organizations have a formal month-end closing process where you close your books 3 weeks after month end, and you have, I would lay out a schedule, which is very comprehensive of who does what and the due date and the date we close their books. And every month it was guaranteed we would produce those financial statements, and they could be relied upon because we had everything was done before we closed the months. So that's important also. And I also want, in terms of, I'm bringing this up in terms of finance, we talked about the instances of fraud. I think it's important that organizations do a fraud risk assessment, because especially now with things changing, processes changing, you need to look at your organization and see if there are certain areas that could possibly be exposed to fraudulent activity. And do you have the proper systems of checks and balances in those systems to mitigate that risk? So I think that's an important part of the finance. And the technology piece, as we spoke about, implementing technology, the cybersecurity, and streamlining processes, is part of implementing the technology. And human resources, obviously the health and well-being of your staff, communicating with your staff, because these ever-changing times, it's important to stay constantly in touch with your staff. And, also make sure that there's a clear understanding of what your staff is doing, how they're doing it, how they're performing. You're doing an evaluation of how your finance department operates, because this is, I hate to say the new normal, but I think now is the time to reevaluate and kind of transform in certain ways your business to meet this new normal, because my feeling is that this new normal is going to last for quite a while. So that would be my 3-point recovery or restart plan.
So we have 4 minutes left. I want to address a specific question in the chat, and then close up with sort of one parting piece of advice that each of you can give to everybody who's joined us. So the specific question, really, maybe this goes to you, Ron. Is it better to just pay back the PPP instead of having it forgiven if the state of New York intends to claw it back from rates and services charged to the state?
Well, I think it depends on your fiscal structure. And if you've got for example, I can think of a $20 million nonprofit that is exclusively funded by contracts with the city. They have little choice. Yes, they should make that a loan. But for example, where we have a fee for service structure plus a contract structure, or if you've got a high charitable structure, that's not double dipping. So I think that look at your fiscal structure to begin with, and that's going to show you what your limits are. And then within that, grab all the cash you can get.
Yes, that's exactly what I would say.
All right, so Ellie, what's your parting piece of wisdom other than grab all the cash you can get?
My parting piece, now is not the time to try to restrict your resources for good financial management. I think that this is the time to invest in proper financial management, because you need the right people on your team and the right expertise to guide the organization through this tough time, to make the tough calls on, are these the right programs to be operating? Is this how we want to be operating in the future? And have people who are capable of doing that work. So, I know it's really easy to say, let's cut our consultants back, 50% or 75% or whatever the case may be. But you really have to think about, well, what is that consultant doing for you? And is it worth the dollars we need to be spending in that area for the work that needs to get done? Perhaps you delay other types of expenses to reinvest in the financial health of the organization right now. So that's my parting piece. Don't just say I'm chopping my consultants off, but you really do need good help right now, and think about that strategically as you make those decisions.
Roberta.
Yes, and I completely agree with it, and that I am a consultant for nonprofits, finance department, so if I could tout my services. But as I mentioned in my opening statement, I have a passion to help nonprofits straighten their finance departments, and it's all about good financial management. I mean, I've seen it all, I've done it all, I've fixed finance departments, and It's a process, but I always say finance is the foundation of a strong nonprofit organization. Somebody once said to me, it's the background music. I said, no, it's not the background music, it's the foundation. So I think that's, keep that in mind. And that would be my parting thought.
Ron, what's your parting thought?
Well, after hearing all of this, I think that we need to be concerned about results and process. So my result is get that cash. My process is avoid jail time.
Avoid jail time is the parting thought. Folks from NYN Media, I think we have 10 minutes allotted for incremental Q&A. We obviously answered a lot of the Q&A as it popped up. Kay, tell us what to do.
Sure. So yeah, I'd like to remind anyone, so we have about 10 minutes until our next panel starts. So if you have any other questions for our panelists right now, please feel free to continue submitting them in while they're here. Thank you, Hillary, Ellie, and Ronald, and Roberta for all taking the time to, talk about all these issues today. In the meantime, I'd also like to thank our sponsors again. Thank you to Cushman & Wakefield, the Parkside Group, Meringue, Citron Cooperman, Incline Pension Consulting, Nationwide Nonprofit Sector Strategies, Pentagra, Roberta Katz Consulting, your part-time controller, NFP Advisors, and St. Joseph's College, New York. Also, feel free to continue using the chat function on the right side of your screen if you'd like to interact with other attendees, share thoughts about what we've been discussing. Just please make sure to change the settings so it's available to all attendees and panelists. And there is also a couple more questions actually streaming in. Is there any guidance about PPP loan forgiveness and participating in a state shared work program? Any thoughts, anyone?
I'm not familiar.
Ellie?
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with what they're referring to as the state shared work program.
I'm not sure.
All right. There's also
Adrian, can you clarify?
yeah, if the respondent wants to clarify and add in some more details, please feel free. You can also send that in through our Q&A function. There's also another question coming in asking debt, how to decide whether to take it on. Any thoughts?
So I would really make sure that you think through a plan to pay it back before you take debt on. It's great to have access to it, but if you have no possible solutions for how you're going to get that repaid and not have to pay penalties, how are you going to get the best interest rates? What's the backup plan if the organization isn't able to raise the additional revenues to be able to pay it back in the allotted amount of time? It's not just having access to the money. That's wonderful, but what are you doing thinking ahead? Okay, how am I going to pay this back? So
Roberta made a comment earlier about checking the sustainability of each of your programs.
Yeah.
And I do not think you should borrow to prop up something that isn't sustainable to start out with, because it's a short-term strategy. I'd be very careful about debt unless you plan to increase your mission through it.
Yeah, I mean, I would personally, I would suggest that some of the debt that's being made available, to me, it's about the cost of the debt. So it's about replacing higher cost debt with lower cost debt, as opposed to adding indebtedness. Adding indebtedness itself is very dangerous. Adding indebtedness that replaces other indebtedness but makes it less expensive for you to carry it is terrific.
Yeah.
All right. And
So go ahead.
There's also some updates about the previous question asking about guidance about PPP loan forgiveness and the state shared work program. And they've clarified the shared work program is a program you can apply for in which the company reduces a percentage of time for folks and the government supplements by employees applying for unemployment. Does that clarify anything? Any thoughts?
I think that's a pretty specific question that Adrian should probably speak with her auditor and tax advisor to get clarification on that.
This might be dipping a bit into what should be coming up in our next panel about the role of boards, but what kind of board support have you seen?
I've seen anywhere from boards giving more money to some pulling back on their pledges. It really depends on the strength of the core strength of the organization. So it really has run the gamut of what boards have done. I've seen people come off of boards, more people being interested in boards. It's really been everything all over the place from what I've seen.
Maybe to rephrase a little bit, what's the optimal role that boards should be playing, and maybe again that's double dipping a bit into the next topic, but as a partner to the organization and to the CEO to navigate all the questions that we're asking here, as well as sort of both sides of the ledger.
Yeah.
I think we're in a grim situation. And I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. The state of New York for us has said $175,000 contracts they do not intend to pay on. So I would say that in terms of the board, I know a nonprofit I worked with in January, and one of the board members, the chair, simply loaned them $200,000 and put it on a credit card for a couple of years until they were able to get back on their feet. And I know there's some tax implications there and paying interest and such and conflict of interest. But I would say, just coming back to the moment we're talking about, some of these topics are not casual. They really involve the existence and survival of our organizations. So I think that the board can be quite a tool here. And I would appeal to them and just be very blunt and honest with the truth and see what happens.
Yeah. And not that they're a tool, they're a necessary involvement, because these are major decisions that organizations are making. If they're changing their mission in any way, that has to have board approval. If they're taking on new debt, that has to have board approval. This PPP, that's debt. From that application, they needed to have it documented that the board said it was okay to apply for it. Same with the EIDL funding. These are things that the board must be involved in. They are fiscally responsible for the oversight of the organization. They can't just wait for an update from management or the CFO to tell them what they did. They have to be part of the decision making.
Right. And I think also if organizations have investment portfolios, it might be time to revisit your investment policy in terms of restricted funds to allow them to be unrestricted. That all has to go through board approval. So that's a very important part of a board's role. I think they could help not only financially with money, but also with making strategic and not long-term, but very short-term strategic decisions. There's a lot of talent on boards I've worked with, are extremely talented, all kinds of backgrounds. And I think they are very much so. I mean, some people are meeting with their boards, once a week or twice a week. So boards are very engaged now and they really want to help. And we need to take this opportunity to use their expertise.
Yeah,
I think that's the right note for us to sort of close on a little bit on the board piece, right? Because there has been a real opportunity here for organizations to get much closer to their boards, right? We increased the frequency of our board communication and engagement by triple in this time. And to Roberta's point, our board really wanted to do it and they felt good for doing it. Board service is service. And people join boards for the most part because it's the way in which they can be of service. And so in this time where people need service more than ever, the opportunity shouldn't be lost to get closer to your board, to take advantage of their expertise and to take advantage of their knowledge to navigate incredibly treacherous waters.
Mm-hmm.
I would just add that I have been doing a management discussion and analysis report on 3 times a year. And I have discovered that also brings the board much closer in a proper way to understanding the operations and the mission.
Yes, I agree.
We're all out of time, but I appreciate you all taking the time to lay all these issues out for us. It's much appreciated. And with that, we can start preparing for our next panel, which is nonprofit leadership and board members can respond to COVID-19. Also, before our panelists join in, I'd just like to alert everyone to other events that City and State will be hosting in the near future. We have a digital NYN event on July 23rd. The registration is free and can be found on our website, which will be linked in the chat later. And we will also have an economic and social equity in New York's virtual event on August 4th. Registration is also free for that. And with that, we can begin with our third panel. Take it away.
Thank you, Kay. Hello, everybody. I am Tracy Lester. I'm the moderator of today's panel, which is entitled How Nonprofit Leadership and Board Members Can Respond to COVID-19. I am joined today by my fellow panelists, Karin Goldman, who's the Deputy Bureau Chief of the Charities Bureau for the New York State Department of Law, Klaus Ellers, who is the CEO of Family Promise, and John Eusanio, who's the partner and not-for-profit practice leader with Citrin Cooperman. Today, we'll be discussing how decision makers in the nonprofit sector are working around the clock to sustain their organizations. Responding to COVID-19 requires us to operate on all cylinders, being responsive and thoughtful, as well as tactical and forward-thinking. Our panelists will be answering some of these questions for you today. What is the board's role in a time of crisis? Should policies be changed? And if so, how? How can the board and staff work together right now to sustain organizations? As the executive director of the National Dance Institute, an arts education program founded over 43 years ago by New York City principal ballet dancer Jacques d'Amboise, our mission is to inspire children towards excellence by using dance as a catalyst for change. We work with over 6,500 children throughout the New York City public school system, so when schools closed, our programming had to shift immediately. We created a response team of senior staff and board to respond to the COVID-19 crisis. We immediately developed an operating plan for remote work and work at home arrangements along with HR policies to support them. We had to take all of our programming online to reach our constituents, which were children and families in public schools who were now at home working and studying remotely. We also applied for the Payroll Protection Program loan, not to mention every emergency grant possible, and reached out to our donor community for support. In addition, we participated in countless Zoom meetings with our peers to discuss how to move forward as an organization and to share learning across the sector and across industries. And we still have much to learn as we enter phase 2 in New York City. You might ask why an arts education program is part of this panel today, as there are many human service and education organizations. And I would say that COVID-19 has drastically altered the landscape for many organizations, but for arts and cultural institutions, the impact is deep. In New York City, arts and culture are considered part of the phase 4 reopening and will remain closed throughout the summer. We've heard that many of our peers won't even be able to reopen until 2021. And then what about their audiences? So for organizations like National Dance Institute, these conversations are critical. For us, the arts are essential, and we need to keep talking about the important role that the arts play in the sector. We're now going to turn to our panelists to hear more about their organizational response to COVID-19. And first, we're going to hear from Karin Kunstler-Goldman with the New York State Department of Law about their response and their virtual guidance. Karin? And you're going to unmute. Let's see if we can help.
Fortunately, the host came to my rescue.
Great.
Thank you all for having me in this very important discussion. These are, I don't have to say this. I think the last panel really said it loud and clear. This is very, very difficult times, very hard times, and especially for nonprofit organizations. The challenges are enormous. And the Attorney General is legally the Chief Law Enforcement Officer of the state, but Attorney General Tish James has also made clear to us that we are to play a role in helping nonprofits in various ways. One of the ways we do this traditionally is we have lots of guidance on our website, and we do in-person outreach to members of the sector. And we've been called upon to do things a little bit differently, as everyone is doing things a little bit differently. And I was asked to describe some of the things that we've done in response to the pandemic and the effects it's had on the nonprofits. And the first thing that came to us, the first question that came to us was, what do? We have to have our meetings. We have to have meetings of members. We have a lot of decisions to make, more decisions than we normally have. But we have to call a meeting and set a place for the meeting and meet in person. So very quickly, we put together guidance that advise the nonprofit sector that, in our view, virtual meetings were appropriate, that they could have them, they could call their meetings via Zoom, via telephone, via WebEx, whatever feature they choose to have. But we also made clear that the same provisions that apply to in-person meetings would apply to virtual meetings, such as giving people notice, setting an agenda, allowing people to hear and be heard, keeping minutes of the meetings. None of that goes away when the meeting is virtual, and that guidance was very well received, and we're very pleased with that. We gave other general guidance that, to a large extent, referred to other guidance. People were just calling us constantly saying, where do we go for this? Where do we go for that? So we compiled guidance that would help people find their way through this maze of complications. The next bit of guidance that we're working on, and another piece of guidance that we've been asked for, is on use of endowments, use of funds that are held as an endowment for use for specific purposes. And that guidance is not out there yet, but I can tell you that we are working on it, and it will be posted. And one thing I want to mention, I mentioned this in our dress rehearsal for this, we have a group of people in a group email called our influentials, and we send out news from the Charities Bureau periodically. And one of the items of news that we send out is a new guidance. So if anyone wants to be on our list and receive the information that we send out, please send us an email to charities.bureau@ag.ny.gov. And if you haven't written that down or you don't remember it, on the Attorney General's website, we have a charities page, and all of the contact information for our office is there. And it's our view that prudence is always required of directors. That responsibility doesn't go away, but we think that organizations can look at their endowments and look at their expenditures in a prudent way, taking into account the unusual circumstances that COVID has presented to us, and maybe use their funding a little bit different. The NIPMIFA, the New York Prudent Management of Investment Funds Act, has steps that organizations must follow in order to use funds from the endowment. And those steps have to be followed. But one of the things that they can take into consideration is financial situations. There have been other questions asked of us about whether endowments can be used as collateral and other use of endowments. We're going to address those issues in our guidance, and we hope that you all get to read them. But primary first in any situation, before the pandemic, after the pandemic, whenever that will be, is that organizations have to follow their mission. They have to carry out their mission, and the directors are there to guide them. But directors are now faced with lots of other issues. And someone asked me the other day, what kind of communication, a friend of mine who's a director, what kind of communication do I have to have with my staff and the people who are running the organization? And the first thing I said, and I should say it here too, I can't give you legal advice, but you've got to look at some other issues. Health, for example. Health is a prime concern of organizations that are operating now. What do we do with people who feel they're sick? What do we do with people who have vulnerable members of their family at home? How do we work out who stays home and who comes to work? These are policies that there's lots of guidance on the web, but what it boils down to is individuals working with individuals. And that becomes a really important aspect in addition to the work of the organization. What are our financial situation? Board members have to be, I think, more involved in figuring out, do we have the assets to carry out this program? What do we need to do to make sure that we can at least function, but are there cuts that we need to make? And then there are the decisions, the big decisions of, do we need to sell off some of our property? Do we need to deaccession some of our possessions? Do we need to join with other organizations and merge? And that's another area in which we are giving guidance, and we're also going to be conducting programs for the sector. And then, of course, there's the sad story of those organizations that will no longer be able to function. And what do they have to do? New York corporations have to come to the Attorney General when they dissolve. We're looking at our procedures. We're looking at how we can make this easier for organizations to dissolve, make sure that their assets that are remaining go to fulfill the purposes for which they were donated. That's our role. It's a statutory role, but in most cases, we're not only fulfilling our statutory role, but we're working with the organization that is in the transaction, helping them navigate the procedures, helping them be in compliance with the law. And I think maybe the first thing that was asked of us before the question about virtual meetings was, what about my financial report? It's due in 2 weeks, and you know, our staff has scattered, and the papers are in the office, and how are we going to do this? Well, one of the first things we did was to give a 6-month extension to organizations whose financial reports were due after mid-February, so that at least that was one worry that we took off their plate. So we're glad to be here, and we encourage people to contact us. There's a lot of information about how to contact us, and what email address to use for what type of questions. And we're there. Well, we're not there, but we're available every day of the week, and we have a program called Attorney of the Day. So each one of us staffs the phone about 1 day a month. And if there are questions that we can answer, we certainly do that. And our turnaround time is pretty quick, even while we're scattered all over the city, the suburbs, wherever we are. So
Thank you, Karin.
thank you for listening to me. And I want to hear from my fellow panel members.
Thank you. I think it's important for people to understand the role of the Charities Bureau, in particular boards of directors. I mean, often the executive director or the finance director is dealing with you directly, or the treasurer. So I think it's helpful for people to hear just all that you're doing right now. So thank you for that overview.
Thank you.
We're going to now move to Klaus Ellers, who is the CEO of Family Promise. And I think you're going to share a case study with us as well.
Yeah, thank you, Tracy, and thank you, Karin. I was afraid, Karin, you were going to end with the conversation about dissolving. I'm like, okay, I have to follow right after dissolving. So I'm going to give a case study. I'm going to talk about our organization. So I'll give a little bit of background on what we did operationally, and then pivot to talk about what we did with our board. And my goal would be, hopefully, I want to kind of catalog what I think are some of the key actions to take as regards to, if you are a nonprofit leader, I'm the CEO of my organization, you know, how you engage your board, how you work with your board during these times of crisis. So let me just start with a quick background. Family Promise is the leading national organization addressing family homelessness. We work through a federated model. We have 200 affiliates around the country, but we're headquartered in suburban New Jersey. in Union County, New Jersey. We have a pretty heavy presence in New Jersey as well. And our operational model is essentially 3 areas. We prevent families from becoming homeless, we serve them in a time of crisis in shelter, and we do long-term stabilization. And all of these are integral, but the shelter program, even though it's not actually our biggest program, is really our flagship program. It's where almost all of our volunteers are engaged. And so a little bit about our shelter program. It's congregate shelter, so multiple families in a mobile environment. We rotate from location to location. Very relational. Volunteers come in and have dinner. They play Uno. Kids play with kids. We typically have about 1,000 volunteers in each one of our communities who are involved, most of whom are over the age of 60. So you could not come up with a worse model to have during a COVID pandemic. As soon as we saw what was going to be happening, we went into overdrive to try to figure out what to do. So I'm going to talk about our operational items, and then, as I said, I want to pivot to what we did with the board because I think that's really important. So fortunately, we had done our strategic plan, and I think if you do not have a strategic plan, that's going to be a difficult situation. If you have one, you really want to pull it out because it gives you a lot of direction. Our strategic plan said we were going to pivot to do more work on the prevention side, preventing homelessness. So we were already planning to sort of de-emphasize, not get rid of, but de-emphasize shelter as a core program and do more work on keeping people in their housing or diverting them from shelter. So we had planned a rollout over the course of the year as we were going to be doing this pivot to doing more prevention. So we immediately accelerated that and got that programming out right away so that we could give all of our constituents a feasible program to do at a time at which shelter was virtually impossible to do. Not to mention the fact that you have all this issue of social distancing and work from home when you're dealing with families who do not have homes. So we did that. We did tons of virtual meetings and trainings with our affiliates, just got information out there and gave them this other operational plan. Second thing that we did is we had a spring event, a giving day on a national platform that we were going to be doing in May. So we scrapped that, moved it up a month, turned it to an emergency campaign, communicated extensively about it, underwrote costs so everybody could participate in it, so that right off the bat there was this rallying event, could bring in funding because nobody knew what was going to happen. We did not know. We knew we were losing funding. We didn't know the expenses were going to go up. So we did that event and we got that messaging out there. We connected with our various corporate partners for PR support. We connected with governmental parties, not just so we could get that guidance, but also so we could establish the value of the national organization. So we had SBA, CDC, HUD, HHS all doing webinars with us to help inform our constituents. We communicated all the time. We just communicated constantly, several communications a week, both in person, having staff talk to constituents, to our affiliates, which are the different participants in our model across the country, as well as doing webinars on a wide range. So there was constantly information coming out. And an interesting observation that we had from this is, if you're the leader of your organization, you're always trying to be strategic. You're always trying to walk ahead. It's the last thing they wanted. They wanted us to walk with them. They did not want to hear me talk about strategy. They wanted tactics because it was crisis. We're in human services. It was all very immediate. And then the last thing I'll say on an operational end is on terms of our staff, we have monthly staff meetings. So we immediately went to weekly staff meetings. We fortunately have a pretty good remote culture. So it was not that hard to pivot to doing things virtually. And then we adjusted. We kept adjusting because we realized the weekly staff meetings were getting to be a bit too much. We were communicating, people feel comfortable enough. The other thing we did is we went to everybody on the staff who had children and said, your children are your priority. Work comes second. You got to take care of your family. You'll get work done in whatever way you get it done. It's going to be okay. And the ultimate outcome of that was there was incredible productivity from the staff. They felt cared for. They felt focused. They felt they could have impact. So that was great. So let me pivot now to the board. And one of the questions is, do you change policies? And no, you shouldn't. You should have all the right policies in place, but you need to change process and procedure. And that's what we did. So we went back to the strategic plan. We identified where the priorities aligned and really leaned in on that to help us with the current situation. The board chair and I established weekly hour-long conversations with an agenda, but also with some flex so that we both could be kind of thinking, and the whole situation was so fluid. That way we could kind of adapt to different changes. Third thing that we did is I involved the board chair in some of our operational meetings because she has a good understanding of the program, so she could get that bird's eye view. But we did not involve board members and any other board members in operational elements, because I think one of the challenges you have here is your board members, they're leaders, they're passionate, they're problem solvers. I mean, some may step away, but a lot of them want to lean in, and you want them to lean in, but if you let them lean into operations, they're going to get involved in operations. And that's a recipe for, just a lot of headaches. Our board meets quarterly. We changed it around. We met every 2 weeks in March, and then we pulled that back to one meeting in April, one meeting in May. We were very information focused with the meetings. We kept them very targeted. I did weekly updates on everything that was going on. And I started off everything with the health. How many people we served were being affected by COVID? How many people died? Because that was ultimately the most important information, right? So it kept the priorities where they needed to be. And then I want to outline 6 different things that we did with board that I think are really some of the things to walk away with. One of those is the emergency appeal gave a tangible action right off the bat. You've got to give the board something tangible to do right off the bat. And that was something they could all rally around, they could give, they could convince people to give. We reached out to them for specific skills. So with the PPP was a disaster when it first came out, right? The rules kept changing. So we had board members that had expertise come in to talk about that. We also looked at our board restricted account, the endowment, because at the beginning we didn't know. We ended up actually doing very well financially, but we didn't know at the beginning how that was going to be. We gave them the opportunity to do ideation, but we really made sure we informed them fully. So it wasn't this open thing where you have board members saying, have you thought of this? Have you thought of that? Which any nonprofit director will tell you is one of the most frustrating things to have happen. And I'll give you a mistake I made. I actually had some tentative ideas I threw out there. That was a bad idea when I threw out some tentative ideas, because the board is like, whoa, how are you gonna do this? And I realized, no, they need things zipped up. Couple other things we did. We started task forces that were led by staff members in different areas, but invited board members in. So they had that visibility, that connection. And then the last step that I want to talk about is where they provided the most value was on strategy. So we've organized for them to take this information, look at different scenarios, and then make recommendations based on those scenarios so that they're not open ideating, they're improving the ideas that the staff has come up with, and they can help us direct where to make organizational investments. And the 7 walkaways I'm going to give: communicate frequently, concisely, and positively. Give the board a rallying point. Give them something they can all focus on. Work strategically with your board chair to how to modulate board engagement so you get that right level of engagement. Increase your meetings. Be very specific in expertise that you want. Highlight board member actions as models. We wanted them to open up their Rolodexes. We were very specific ways they could do that. When they did that, we showed that to other board members. It was a model. And then the last thing is give them a prescribed, relevant planning project. Don't try to do major strategic planning right now, because that is going to be an incredible burden on the organization. So that's it.
I was unmuted. I have a question for you, class, before we move on to John. One of the things we talked about was your federated model, and I was wondering if you could just touch on that briefly, sort of what that means. Sure. And how that worked. I think there are organizations on here who have membership models or affiliate models.
And that was our constituents, right? So we have 200 affiliates. So we're serving our affiliates who are then serving the families. So we had to think about how do we equip them, the affiliates. And so all those things I described, we were doing with the affiliates, with the EDs and board chairs of our different affiliates around the country. And again, doing the Giving Day event, the emergency appeal event, that meant they had money coming in right off the bat, which really just, it gave them some comfort and increased their ability to take our guidance and advice. And so we figured out every way we could provide value from the very onset so that they who are in a lot of tension, a lot of fear, could feel that they could turn to us as guidance.
And is there one board of directors for the affiliates, or does
no, each affiliate has its own board of directors? Yep. Okay. So and they're in Lima, Ohio, they're in Wasilla, Alaska, they're in Houston, Texas. So it's a wide variety.
Great. Thank you. John, now we're going to switch to you. I think you're going to talk with us a little bit more about some of the tactical work you did with clients during this time.
Yeah, thanks, Tracy. And thanks everyone for allowing us here to talk on this topic, and great points by all members, panel here and before. And I think there's been a lot of overlap on some of the things that we're talking about. But As the practice leader and partner at Citron, what we do is provide audit, tax, and accounting and advisory services. So when the pandemic hit immediately, one of our first things, like many others, was to post a COVID-19 resource center so that our clients, our prospects, anyone that really needed the information from a nonprofit standpoint can gather the information. As you mentioned, when PPP came out, total mess. And quite honestly, it's still changing. It changes day by day. There's new FAQs that are coming out on a daily basis, new structures. So we try to disseminate that data to our in a timely fashion, whether it was through webinars, whether it was through articles, and working hand in hand with some of our clients. And you're right, though, that this does take both a management perspective and a board's perspective. When you're talking about issuing new debt, you're talking about entering into loans and potential federal awards and things along those lines. It really takes the entire organization to be involved. And as I think we've mentioned on previous seminars and previous things done with the organization, the relationship between the board and the executive director really needs to be there. It needs to be strong. It has to be fluid information that's going back and forth, open and honest, and really talking about the impacts that decisions are making and how things need to get done. So I think that's an important thing. But as we look at the pandemic, as we look at the crisis and all that's transpired over the last couple of months, a couple of recurring themes keep coming along. Those that talk about where you were pre-pandemic, while you were in it, and then post. A lot of us are now focusing on the post, hopefully on the post section of this stage. And really the question becomes, what have we learned? What has the organization learned, and where does it see itself going into the future? And I think I've come up with 3 areas I wanted to touch on that really focus in around common themes and areas surrounding crisis and risk management committees and what their functions might be. Maybe talking about strategic planning, and I know Klaus highlighted this, and yes, there's a need to do some strategic planning at this point, in my opinion, but it may not be as long-term as some strategic plans may have been in the past, and the different considerations that go into that. And then finally, talking about just general risk assessment. What is the discussions, not just at the management level, but at the board level surrounding risk management? We think about the for-profit world, and when the whole Enron thing came out, and SOX 404 and enterprise risk management, those are topics that haven't gone away. And those are the types of things that I think are getting a renewed interest at the board level, in my experience in talking to some of these entities. So if we were to just jump into the first area about a crisis or a risk committee that might have been formed, a lot of nonprofits took the opinion that immediately they formed a task force if it wasn't there. Those that had a task force or a crisis committee generally were able to respond maybe in a quicker fashion and roll out certain protocol that they've done. But I think that a lot of nonprofits just didn't have that. They thought about risk, they had certain issues and financial considerations, but this pandemic, unfortunately, was swift and not anticipated. And so reacting to it took a little bit more time. And I think depending on the size and nature of your organization, you may have responded quicker than some, or not so quick. And the question becomes, from a crisis committee standpoint, should you have one? Should you form one? Should you have one going forward? And more importantly, what does it serve? What does it do? It needs to be a committee, and I don't think it's comprised just of the board. I think it's comprised of programmatic, critical people at the organization. Yes, that includes the executive director and the CFO. Yes, that includes program personnel that delivers on the core program and mission of the organization. It involves folks from IT, especially given what we've seen from information technology. And it also involves potentially fundraising personnel, and also maybe PR people. The point being that a committee needs to blend all the critical areas of the organization and be able to respond quickly and rapidly in the crisis. But post-crisis, I think it needs to also think about events that have occurred in the past events that are occurred currently, and then look into the future and see where you might be able to plan and focus in on to mitigate these types of things. Can never mitigate risk completely, right? But what you need to be able to do is be able to have a plan to respond to it so that your constituents know how you're progressing and what you're doing as an organization to continue your mission, to show that sustainability for the organization. So, I think that having a risk management or a risk committee is important. I think having a manageable risk committee is important as well. We don't want this to be 20 people, nothing will get done. Again, the committee needs to be focused, needs to be able to take action quickly and be able to respond in a timely fashion. And more importantly, I think risk in general, when you think about it, has always been there, right? We've had pandemics before. We've had recessions, we've had depressions, we've had terrorist acts, unfortunately, and we've had natural disasters. We need to, I think, understanding how we've responded to those in the past and not necessarily recreating the wheel, but having strategy around how you handle that is something that at a board and management level need to be focused in on together. So that as these, unfortunately, will continue into the future, we're able to have some protocol. And Tracy, you mentioned a lot of collaboration that's been occurring over the last couple of months. It's fantastic. I've seen so many not-for-profits working with each other in all different lights, trying to leverage best practices. And I encourage that. I think it's important that you reach out to your peers, you reach out to your advisors, and you understand what others are doing and share best practices, because we're all in it together, right? We're all serving this for a common good, for our constituents, for our communities. In times of need, they look to the nonprofits in order to continue to service those that are most needy. So I think a risk committee is one of the areas I would definitely focus on first. My next topic, is talking a little bit about strategic planning. And when we talk about strategic planning, this is really business planning, like Klaus said. And you had a plan, you had strategy as to where you wanted to be, maybe 3, 4, 5 years from now, maybe 10 if you were really aggressive. But that's changed. Unfortunately, the situation that we're in now has gone from that long-term outlook to, in some cases, week to week, and others from month to month. We've worked with clients to do cash flow modeling, to do projections, to look at costs and report up to the board as to recommendations and actions that they may be necessary to take, and ways to mitigate exposure for the organization, both currently and long term. You need to think about, when you think about PPP and EIDL, some mentioned it on the previous conversation about how do you record it? And what are the ramifications if this becomes a loan, and how will it be reported out, especially considering that not-for-profits filing with the Charities bureaus, filing the 990s, and having their data out there in public is available. The board needs to understand it is there. It's being shown to the public at large. So I think that, from a strategic planning, looking at what's happened and looking long-term kind of go hand in hand. And when I think about strategic planning, I'm looking at internal capabilities for delivering on program. And someone brought up volunteers before, I think it was Klaus. How are volunteers going to be impacted going forward? Are you going to have the same level of service from a volunteer? Is that going to need to be replaced somehow in order to continue to carry the mission? So those are strategy considerations that need to be considered. Think about an association that's had their conferences impacted at this point and unable to have them. They've switched to a virtual platform. How well has that worked? Do you want to consider potentially bifurcating your revenue stream and hosting a virtual conference and a live conference into the future? All things that go into strategic planning need to be considered at the management level, but more importantly at the board level for how you determine where you want to come out of this. And then just looking at overall communications between where you see the organization at the board and governance level and where you anticipate disseminating that information to the rank and file within the organization. Do they understand your vision of where you want to be 6 months from now, 1 month from now? Do you need to, 12 months from now? you need to recalibrate any of your expectations. You need to recalibrate your programs. Some mentioned on the previous seminar, looking at programs from sustainability and looking to see if it's gaining profits and things along those lines. And yes, financial sustainability is important. It's been a key word that's been out there, but there's also program sustainability. Are you able to still conduct the programs that are most meaningful to the organization? Or have you strayed into different areas that just may not be where you want to focus your attention? And in those situations, the board needs to consider, is it time to merge? Is it time to transfer some of these programs to other organizations that may be better suited for it? So there's a lot of considerations that need to be taken about as you start to look at strategy. One of the other things that goes into strategy, as I mentioned before, there's two other components: information technology and budgeting. And when I think about budgeting, all of our assumptions, all of the things that we've known from the past that really would give the board and the management comfort in budgeting are pretty much gone at this point. You really can't plan for expenses. You can't plan for what's going to happen with this pandemic. You need to almost have three scenarios: a best, middle of the road, and worst scenario that you can really play out and speak to the board about how you're pivoting in real time so that decisions can be made timely. And then from an information technology standpoint, is the board getting the right dashboards? Do they have dashboards? Do they have the right information in order to funnel the data that's being pulled in for the organization real time and make effective decisions? I think one of the things I've heard a lot recently is that dashboards didn't exist, or that the matrices that they need in order to make these decisions weren't readily available. And that speaks to the information technology system in some cases. So designing good dashboards going forward may be something that the board may want to request, not to get on a monthly basis or even on a day-to-day basis, but at certain intervals have good data that it can make business decisions from. So, when you think about technology, again, I think technology has saved us in a large aspect from continuing to work from home and be remote and productive. But technology needs to be, nonprofits, depending on the nonprofit and the size, has not necessarily been on par with what other technology has been for other organizations, and specifically the for-profit world. And I think that there's always that tough call between investing in program and investing in infrastructure, whether it be buildings, whether it be program sites, whether it be IT. And I think, as was said previously, having a IT that's robust, that has that information that can be utilized and processed is going to be a wave of the future, and is going to be something that all nonprofits need to really consider in this day and age and moving forward. So those go into strategy. And then just finally, highlighting on certain areas around risk management. And this kind of goes hand in hand with governance and strategy setting. An enterprise risk management plan is something that I think all not-for-profits should have. And there's varying stages that you can do. You can go really crazy and have a full-blown ERM process and project, which is very, very robust and very expensive and time-consuming. But that's not necessarily the way you need to always do it. There are ways to identify risks at a lower level. You can scope out your risks. You can figure out where the areas are that are most critical, and then try and plan to tackle a few of those one by one on a rotating basis. An ERM plan really is looking at all risk, not just financial. It's looking at reputational risk. It's looking at IT and cyber, as well as overall financial indicators for the organization. But think about, Klaus mentioned previously that, or I think it was Karin, if you're going back to work and you have individuals that contract COVID now on site, what's the reputational harm that comes to your organization? If you're doing things that are called questionable into practice, or your IT is vulnerable and you have cyber breaches, how does that impact the organization, both from a lender's perspective, a funder's perspective, or even more importantly, from just a donor's perspective overall? these things need to be considered. And so what we recommend is that the board take on a emphasis of risk categorization, looking at risks holistically at each level within the organization. Do a heat map, as they call it, or what's critical, what's low risk, and what's moderate risk, and try and identify not necessarily remediations for everything, because certain risks you just can't remediate. But if you did have a cyber breach, what would be your plan of action? What are the protocols that you're going to follow? If another crisis happens, or if someone, God forbid, encounters COVID from an employee standpoint, what is the response plan that you as a board and management knows are to be taken so that you can show prudence and fiduciary responsibility at that level?
John, I think crisis management is really key, and I think it's a great point to touch on. I think also here we want to talk about just communication, which is the biggest part of this conversation around COVID, which is how the board and the leadership communicate with each other and how they communicate with the staff and the constituents. So that's a critical part to this conversation. I think you also talked about recalibrating, and for every organization, a recalibration occurred over these last few months. For arts organizations like National Dance Institute, the recalibration was taking programming that was school-based and converting it to online programming. And that, for many organizations, was a huge lift. We were able to do it with our artistic director sort of leading us through this process, but there are arts organizations who it took months to get programming online. But communicating with the board around this all along the way was really essential for their understanding and also for their advocating on behalf of the programs that they're overseeing and supporting, understanding what the shifts are and why they're occurring is key. So I just wanted to say that for the people who are listening, because there's so many things that went into play over these last few months. And now, of course, we're in phase 2. And if you're listening to us, you may be in other parts of the country and you're already in phase 3 or phase 4. COVID's still with us, but the operational aspect of the work continues. Sort of having people re-enter the work area is huge. And keeping them safe while they're in it is huge. And board members will need to kind of move in tandem with us as we go through these transitions. And who knows what the next crisis or event will be. I think, Klaus, you wanted to mention about a conversation you had with your board chair about recent events.
Yeah, I think just right, we're dealing with 2 pernicious viruses at this time. One is COVID, but the other one obviously is structural racism. And in our line of work, 40% of people in this country who experience homelessness are African American, but they're only 13% of the population, and that is a direct byproduct of structural racism. So when the George Floyd murder happened, my board chair and I, we sat down and talked about it, because we had, you could not turn a blind eye to this. We had to step forward on this. And so, we really, we looked at this and we said, okay, we need to stand forward. We need to, we need to speak out. We also, we don't want to be hollow in what we do. So we really focused in our messaging on that connection between housing and structural racism. So it wasn't just sort of, you have these corporations, these nice big kumbaya messaging that, what does that ultimately really mean? So we really wanted to say this is authentic to who we are. And a couple of actions that we took I did my messaging to our constituents, but she did messaging to all of the board chairs among our affiliates. So it was a peer-to-peer message, which I think was really powerful. The other thing is that we've been doing work on DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, but we realized we needed to really double down on that. And she formed a committee within the board to really tackle this and look at this, not just in terms of a one-off thing. How does this become embedded in everything the board does? And included, diverse members of the board to really go through that process so that it was not just, okay, let's learn about implicit bias and then, go home and pretend we've solved it. And I think it's really important. I think you have to, as leaders, have to be having conversations with your board about structural racism. No matter what field you're in, it's a major impact, and it's something that we're all called on to do something about.
Yeah, thank you. I agree. I appreciate your bringing that up. I think that COVID was the topic, but as we know, as leaders in this field, every day there could be something new that we have to respond to. that could be a crisis, and certainly what's happening across the country is a crisis.
Yeah,
and
I think that,
go ahead, Karin.
Yeah, COVID is the driving force for this panel, but also in the Attorney General's office, as we're told that we can reach out to nonprofits in a compliance mode rather than an enforcement mode. I have to give a shout out to the Attorney General, who is doing a lot of outreach with regard to as class says, the other virus, racism. She is conducting town hall meetings. The Civil Rights Bureau is handling countless complaints and acting upon them. And it's something that the boards, I think, have to consider in this difficult time, but this positive time in terms of addressing racial disparity and considering that in terms of board structure. There are organizations, nonprofit organizations out there that are helping boards become diverse, and it's something that, you know, it's not something that we do in our office, but it's something that I think boards should be looking at going forward.
Yes, definitely, they should be. And I think to the point earlier when we talked about changing policies versus procedures or procedures, there are times when you need to revisit your policies and your bylaws and your governing documents, and that, you know, this is a time for that, both related to racial equity in the workplace as well as health and safety, which that is a part of. COVID-19 also has some implications for operations that may need to be revisited through governing documents. Karin, there was a question earlier for you about the way that people submit material to the Charities Bureau. It's a little technical, but it had to do with PDFs instead of physically mailing the documents to the office. I mean, one of the things that's happening is everyone's working from home. So having to submit either online grant applications or tax returns and things, people would like to do it virtually, but it looks as though maybe that's
are very, you know, we moved 2 years ago. We have a much smaller footprint. So we decided that it was time for us to join the 21st century. We now have required electronic registration. We get no more paper. We have working toward doing that for annual filings, and we happily take any documents as PDFs by email. It's, first of all, it's no paper, but the other thing is it's much easier for us to work with it because we can then shoot it out to the attorney who's supposed to be handling those documents. So we accept PDFs of signatures, we accept PDF petitions and supporting documents in all of our transactions, sales, mergers, amendments to certificates of incorporation. All of those transactions may be submitted as PDFs. And the other thing I neglected to mention is that we now have a customer service unit that is totally dedicated to responding to members of the public, responding to representatives of nonprofits. They're doing it by email now, but when we're back in the office, we'll be going back to phone lines. They're there every day, whether they're in their living rooms or you know, sitting in the park with a computer. So please make use of our customer service unit and make use of the other email addresses that are on the web and where you can send specific documents addressing specific issues.
Great, thank you. We have a few more minutes and we're happy to answer questions if you'd like to submit them through the Q&A. I did want to revisit the topic of strategic planning. At National Dance Institute, we immediately pulled out our strategic plan as we went to virtual work at home and virtual online programming. Because for us, so much of our programming was in schools, and because the schools were closed, we had to revisit what that meant for us. In our case, we were able to shift, although it sounds easy, it wasn't, to shift our programming online to reach the children that we work with. But it meant having to look at the strategic plan goals that have growth and expansion in them, and not really being able to respond to it in this time, because we don't know what's going to happen with the Department of Education. We don't know what's going to happen with schools in New York City. You know, we need to wait to see what's happening in other states across the country as we look at those specific goals. So I do just want to echo what Class said about, you know, looking at your strategic plan, not necessarily changing it, but make sure that you're checking in with it and to see where you have alignment with it versus where you may have to push pause. And pushing pause doesn't mean suspending or canceling. It just means sort of taking a breath, giving yourself time to regroup. And it's a very important thing to do right now, especially as we're in kind of a holding pattern. And here in the city council is meeting this week to talk about the budget. It's a very important time for organizations all over this city, and perhaps other cities in the country, it's the same sort of timeline. But the fiscal year is coming to an end, and everyone's waiting to see what's going to happen with the budget. So, and communicating that to your boards is really critical as well. John, do you want to talk a little bit more about what you're seeing with some of your clients in terms of the strategic planning work that they're doing? Are you seeing that they are putting them on hold? What are you seeing?
I think that's something that's on hold. I think that's more down the road at this point. But, you know, again, a lot of the clients are on a, it's still a survivability mode, right? We have all ranges of not-for-profits. We have those that are social service, that are really being impacted by not being able to provide services and programs because of the shelterings and things like that have occurred. You have associations that are still dealing with the conferences and the lack of revenues. And, you know, many nonprofits are June 30th, so they're coming up to their year ends at this point too. And a lot are starting to think about, well, we're finalizing this year. We need to figure out how much are we left with and what can we do into the future with our balances and our reserves, for that matter, if we have any reserves. So I think strategy is going to be important on a week-to-week and cash flow modeling standpoint for many entities that are break-even, as most nonprofits are, and understanding the cash flow model as to where expenses may be mitigated. You know, obviously payroll is one of the first line items. It's unfortunate, but you can only cut so much before you start to impact delivery of the program. So where else can you extend vendors? Where else can you look for additional funding from federal sources and state sources and things like that? These are all considerations that are strategic, and it's strategic planning, but not necessarily long-term strategic planning. It's survivability planning in some of these situations.
Yeah, thank you. Also, as just sort of a last comment, and I'll give you each a moment to say sort of parting comments. I believe on the last panel, as they were ending, they talked about sort of engaging your board. And I just want to say that again, because during this time, the people who know you the most are your board members, and they're there because they want to support your cause. They're your advocates, they're your supporters, they're your fundraisers, they're your communication vehicles. So, you know, take advantage of them, use them, they're home, they're happy to hear from you. We also learned that a group that we weren't engaging enough, but that we really needed to, were the parents of the children in our programs. And they came to us and said, how can we help you? So we offered them tools, you know, here, contact your city council member, here's how. Go on social media, show why the arts matter. You know, start mini fundraisers and for, you know, your child's school or for this organization. And so we tried to give them the tools to help because they asked us for tools. And so just take advantage of the people who are closest to you, who know you the best. Karin, is there anything you want to say before we wrap up? Any last parting comment?
Well, what I want to stress is that, you know, there's been talk about outreach, and people. I don't think people think in terms of reaching out to the government. You know, there's that old saying, "We're the government, we're here to help." But I think in our case, it really is true. And if there are issues that are facing nonprofits that want our view on, do we have to come to you? Can we do this without Attorney General involvement? Please come to us. If there are areas where we don't have guidance and people think that guidance is appropriate, we get a lot of our ideas from members of the nonprofit sector. Obviously, a good example of that is our guidance on virtual meetings. That didn't start with us. It started with inquiries from members of the sector. So I think remember that we're there, and that part of our marching orders, our mission is to be there to work with the sector.
Thank you for that. John, do you have any parting comments?
I just want to re-echo what you previously said. I think is that, and Klaus and the committee in general, the panel in general, communication is critical, and I think over communication is preferred at this point. I think it's not just communication with your donors or your constituents, it's communication internally to your employees so they know what's going on, how you're handling and addressing risk, to quell the fear that exists out there, that, you know, from a personal and professional aspect. So, you know, communicate and reach out to your advisors. I think that's the other thing. Your advisors are there to help, all vendors, all advisors. Utilize your board, yes, and also utilize your advisors. They will help you try and get through this as best they can.
Thank you. And Klaus, it looks like we're wrapping up.
Well, and I'm going to touch on something each one of you said. So with what John said about communication, and it's okay to communicate that you do not know. I mean, there's so much we don't know. It is okay to say we do not know this. This is what we know of it, and and this is what we're thinking about, but we do not know. You certainly don't want to present like you know something if you don't. And there's a lot we don't know. The second thing is, Tracy, to your point, your board wants to do things, and so give them things to do. Figure out what it is that they can do well, what they really provides value, what's kind of within their scope, but definitely reach out to them, ask them to do it. You're not in this alone, and be honest with them about how you're doing. They know it too. I mean, most of them are leaders in organizations, and they know how hard it is to be the leader and worry about all these things. And then the last thing I'll say to what Karin said is, one of the things that we've been doing is we've been saying to ourselves, we've been saying to our affiliates, imagine you were just inventing this now. What would you create? Would you create exactly the same program we had before? Would you do something different? And an example of that is the social services. Everything's in person. All the case management is in person.
Right.
It doesn't need to be. A 22-year-old mom in our program is a lot more comfortable with this than she is with talking to somebody. And so we actually have the opportunity to say we need to become much more technologically focused. So let's reinvent ourselves to what our current reality is, rather than our kind of received wisdom that we've had all these years. Tracy, thank you very much for moderating us.
Thank you all. So I'm going to turn this over to Kay with New York Nonprofit Media.
Yes, thank you all for taking the time out of your day to participate in this panel, and also to our attendees for listening in on all of today's discussions. And please feel free to join us again tomorrow for the second installment of Nonprofit OpCon, which starts also again at 1 p.m. Also join us and our partners at Be Social Change for the Nonprofit Connector, a facilitated networking event on Thursday evening at 6 p.m. It's a great time in an online setting to continue connections that you've made here, meet other nonprofit professionals, grow your network, and share resources and best practices to strengthen the sector. All OpCon attendees have access to free tickets when you register with the code nonprofit100. And thank you again to our sponsors, Cushman & Wakefield, the Parkside Group, Hamerang, Citron Cooperman, Incline Pension Consulting, Nationwide Profit Sector Strategies, Pentagra, Roberta Katz Consulting,